Welcome to the Beauty Myths Camp. This is an initiative from Beauty SciComm. We're trying to increase the volume, quality, and reach of accurate science content. Our first talk today is from Jen Novakovich, the co host of this camp, as well as a founding member of Beauty SciComm. She's a cosmetic scientist and science communicator at the EcoWell, and she's going to talk to us about sustainability. So, our first myth that we're going to get Jen to bust or talk about is what sort of packaging should we be looking for if we're trying to be more sustainable?
This one's complicated. It really depends on the product type. There's going to be a more environmentally friendly option for any given formula. For example, you may expect package free to be better in the context of toothpaste. There's actually been LCAs to show that actually plastic tubes improve the environmental footprint of these products. Little things that I would look for, things like monomaterials, not excessive packaging, but in terms of packaging format, it's not such a simple answer as glass is better than plastic. Well, glass is heavy and therefore it's actually more intensive to produce. It's more intensive to transport the product, and it's not non intensive to recycle, and it's not indefinitely recyclable. Aluminum, more intensive to produce. It doesn't work for every formula type, and so it might not even be viable there. Heavier, sometimes plastic is the better option. Obviously, there's a lot of variability, so I think because there's so much variability, kind of looking for that monomaterial, probably generally a good thing. Look for recyclability claims on labels as well. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's complex and it really depends.
So, we've heard a lot about how ingredients like parabens are supposedly bad for our health, but we've also been hearing more about how they're also bad for the environment. I guess, are they? And more generally, are so called clean ingredients better for the environment?
There's no evidence really to show an adverse accumulative kind of impact from parabens that are used in cosmetics on the environment. Petro derived, so there's that. Sometimes there's a net benefit from producing products via that pathway. I think the bigger question that I have specifically with parabens is around shelf life and the advantages that has for a product's impact, because if you have a more effective preservative system, then that may increase the length of the product's shelf life, reduce the wastage, and that may end up having a net benefit. The environmental impact of a product goes a lot further than individual ingredients. And sometimes individual ingredients that you feel are bad may have this hidden benefit that you don't really think about. And I think parabens are a really good example. Compare and contrast to some of the other clean preservatives that, well, you may have seen some of the recalls this past year of products going moldy on the shelves. That's a lot of waste, and that's not without impact. Are clean ingredients less impactful than not clean ingredients? Well, like, what do you mean by clean? That's the first question. But many people have this assumption that, like, if it's more natural, then it must be better and cleaner. Sometimes natural ingredients are more or less impactful. It really depends. Ingredients that would fit within a clean label, like extracts, well, extracts have this huge problem right now of firstly wild sourcing that we understand to be very bad for the environment. It's better to cultivate. Also, illicit trade. Licorice is a really good example where there's currently more licorice on the market than that's what is currently available. And so that tells you a lot about the dynamics of adulteration, another issue within these ingredient types. I mean, sometimes clean ingredients may be less impactful, but it's really a case by case basis, and the origin of material doesn't really tell you a lot about the environmental impact because there's so much more to it along the supply chain. What happens, what's the treatment of workers, what's the processing like, and so on and so forth.
Another big trend we've been seeing a lot is like the idea of like a waterless product. So, are waterless products more sustainable?
Oh, this is a blanket statement that really bothers me, and I see it all over my LinkedIn. Sometimes they may have a benefit, but many times they don't. You have to ask yourself, what are you replacing the water with? And then what's the impact of that finished product? It really depends on the product type. So, like, obviously, if you're doing a solid product, there's a benefit with respect to packaging reductions. Packaging isn't the only impact factor of a product. Coming back to that toothpaste tab versus toothpastes in tube example, that's a really good example. That format requires more, the tab, more water from the consumer who's using the product compared to the toothpaste in tubes. And oftentimes, for wash off products, the water usage, especially warm water usage from consumers, ends up being one of the more impactful areas of the product's life cycle. There's complexity there, but then coming to oil based cleansers that are water free compared to a gel cleanser that has water. That oil cleanser requires so much more water to use it. At the end of the day, for pretty much everything that we're going to talk about in sustainability, it always ends up being it's like complicated. It's complicated and it really depends on the product type, even for packaging, for where the consumers are and what they have accessible to them with respect to, for example, recycling infrastructure. But now we're coming back to that initial question, but back to the waterless. No, doesn't mean that it'll be more sustainable. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not.
Okay, on to another common marketing claim. I keep seeing places that say petrochemicals are not sustainable, they're terrible for the environment. Are they? Like, there are so many myths around this. Can you take us through some of them?
Obviously, societally, we want to move away from petroleum sourcing. Obviously, that's very important. But while the world is still fueled by the fossil fuel sector largely, we still have cars on the road. And even with some of the bills that are coming forth to reduce our demand on gas for cars, it's still going to be on the market for quite a while. And so while we have this on the market, you have all these byproducts that you could potentially use. And so the question is, do we just like not use it because we want to move away from petroleum? Or do we use that? For cosmetic ingredients, there's no petroleum sourcing for the sole intent of producing cosmetic ingredients. We have historically been really good at the chemicals industry finding uses for waste products. I'm not really a fan of the claim upcycled. Personally, I feel like that's a greenwashed claim because we try to eke everything that we can out of ingredients. And so, like, if you're okay with saying avocado rinds or whatever, the outside of avocados, the skins, are upcycled. If you're okay with that, then you should probably also be okay with saying petrochemicals are upcycled ingredients. Nobody wants to say that. Also, when you go and look at the carbon emissions associated, and obviously carbon emissions aren't the only impact factor of a product, but associated with petrochemical ingredients and their natural counterparts, because you can produce nature identical ingredients that have the same chemistry as what you'd find in nature. A really good example of this is menthol. It's like 100 times something about there. I'd have to relook at the LCA. Simrise, an ingredient company, did an LCA on this a little while back, but somewhere in the ballpark of like 100 times more impactful to produce menthol naturally compared to producing it via petrochemicals. With the natural category, you also have to contend with like the agricultural space required to produce these ingredients and this scenario of competing with food crops. We know that the largest impact that we have on biodiversity is the expansion of agriculture. We also know that we are struggling with feeding the world. And so crops that compete with food crops generally are thought of as a problem. And I mean, I don't have time to go into that topic. It would be something that I would encourage you to look more into when you're kind of assessing, does this make sense? But a big thing that I usually do is like, does this compete with food crops? Or is it something that's like a byproduct, cover crop, something like that for the natural ingredient? Petrochemicals may or may not be the less impactful ingredient at the time, and even the time is going to impact the environmental impact, because the environmental impact of petrochemical ingredients probably is going to go up as we are reducing our demand of petroleum. But at this current stage, it's probably a different equation. So it's really, at the end of the day, it's complex and it depends, to continue to quote one of my favorite cosmetic chemists, Dr. Anke Ginsberg.
Thank you so much, Jen, for taking us through some of these big myths about sustainability. The big takeaway, I guess, is that sustainability is complicated and there just aren't any good blanket rules. So we have some time now for audience questions. If you have any questions, please pop them into the chat box. Thank you so much, Jen, for telling us about sustainability. So, our first question is from Neural. I'm hoping that's how I pronounce your name. Is it true that tube packaging skincare is better than tub packaging due to hygiene issues? So, for example, with moisturizer.
Uh, I would say no. Every formula will be tested for example, preservative efficacy in its given package. So the formula will be formulated for that packaging to make sure that it is hygienic, safe for consumers. So no. And this would also include for for sustainability. And, it may actually be easier to have a monomaterial package for a tub compared to a tube. So it's one of those things, like we kept coming up in the video, that it's really complex and it depends, but the formula will be formulated for the packaging.
A question from Claire. Are there any particular ingredients that are specifically worth avoiding because of their environmental impact?
I mean, I don't like to vilify individual ingredients just because there's so much complexity. Like I bring up often the case of licorice, and there is a lot of I believe I brought it up in the chat. There's a lot of wild harvesting and illicit trade, and there are all of these issues. But that doesn't represent all licorice. It represents some licorice. So even within this one ingredient where there are problems, I feel uncomfortable making a blanket statement. So blanket statements just often just don't really work. But there are certainly some issues within certain ingredient categories, like extracts, like essential oils, but that doesn't represent all of them.
Here's another question from Cosmetic Larry, which is, I guess, kind of along the same lines. As LCA and sustainability are very complex notions, how can we make sure that we use more sustainable cosmetic products?
I would look for more substantial sustainability claims. So claims language on packages have to be truthful, but there's a lot of gray right now in moving regulations and enforcement globally, depending on where you are. But maybe it would be easier to look for, specific claims that can be substantiated versus generalized unsubstantiatable claims. So, for example, companies will say, this is green, this is sustainable. Well, when you look at most regions' greenwashing guidance, like the green guides by the FTC, these generalized claims are deceptive. So maybe that's not the claim to look for, and instead look for example, specific metrics. So they may have some specific LCA data with like a carbon footprint. Now, it's not perfect, but that's something, if you're looking for language on a package or on their website, those would be things to look for. So companies who are kind of overblowing it, well, I mean, maybe that's not it. And companies that are being a bit more specific and careful in making sure that they comply with claims regulations, well, that at least shows me that
Hmm.
they're taking the right steps.
So this question, I've actually been wondering about this as well. So from Dirk Jackton, which brand has your favorite sustainable packaging and why?
I am not a packaging guru, so I tend to look for more of the total impact versus something so specific to packaging. And I would probably direct this question to someone like Allison Turquoise, who's a packaging consultant. I'm generally more interested in formula. So I'm just gonna like defer to her. Maybe ask more full product environmental impact, and more on the formula is more my wheelhouse.
I guess a related question from me. Is there a brand who you think is doing really well in the sustainability like arena, or at least like something that a brand is doing really well at the moment?
So I mean, this may be an unpopular opinion, but as I was going through my education in environmental science, the brand that I always refer to for what they're doing as kind of a benchmark was Procter and Gamble. When you go and look at their sustainability reporting and the substantiation they do there, you can look at it year over year to see the benchmarking that they're doing. They're a very good example for what companies can be doing. They're doing a lot. They've got billions of dollars to invest in this kind of thing. So don't hold small brands to the same standards. But when I'm working as a sustainability consultant, I'll often refer the brands that I work with to look at their sustainability management programs and sustainability reporting of like, this is what you could strive for. So they do a really good job. No one's perfect, but with their sustainability reporting, it's very impressive.
I guess one last question, maybe, or second last. How do you think we can pressure brands to be more sustainable?
This is really complicated, and I'm gonna struggle answering this in such a short time. When I think about things that brands should be doing, this is where you could pressure. They could be communicating ethically to their consumers, so not overblowing their claims. I like to refer to the Terror Choice 7 sins of greenwashing. So if you see brands doing this, so like generalized claims, that's one example of like a deceptive claim, even within that framework, widely seen as that's deceptive. So when brands are using this kind of language, you could say, why? And please tell us exactly why you feel that you're doing better, because there's just some evidence that when brands are so vocal about it, they're more likely to just window dress rather than actually do something. Oftentimes the brands that are talking less are doing more, and that's really counterintuitive for consumers. The other thing that like I've kind of, as I've learned more about this topic, kind of started leaning towards is thinking about what their like kind of policy and education footprint is. Because when you think about the systemic issues of sustainability, environmental change, climate change, these are really the things that we need from brands. They all need to kind of work together, come together, have the landscape be amenable. So that could even be with education with respect to, like, for example, some of the larger brands teaching smaller brands about biodegradability. Some ingredient suppliers do this. Intellex just had a really great presentation about biodegradation just to do thought leadership. So kind of pushing and supporting companies to do things like that to foster sustainability, like good sustainability conversations, and also have policy footprints, which is really complicated. And I'm now over time. I'll just say I have a podcast coming up about this with like my favorite environmental expert, Mark Trexler, on my podcast is coming back in October. So if you want a lot more, because it's a really complex conversation, listen to that and you'll hear about an hour conversation about that. But that's all I can give you in a minute.
Thanks so much, Jen. We'll move on to our next talk, and don't forget, if you have any questions, pop them in the chat box.
So I'm here with Dr. Michelle Wong, who is a science communicator at Lab Muffin Beauty Science, and she's also the co-host of this Beauty Myths Camp with me here today. And we're going to be talking about actives. And so I'll just get straight to it. My first question for you: do products with actives actually work? How much of this is marketing? And do products actually work?
That's a really good question. And unfortunately, the answer isn't that straightforward. It really depends on the product. So, what you're looking for really is you need to have active ingredients that work, but you also need a delivery system in the product that can get that active into your skin and or scalp or whatever it is and get it to whatever target it has inside your body. So it needs to act on some sort of thing inside your body to have some sort of change. And some actives are easier to deliver than other ones. It really depends. And one of the aspects, there's a lot of aspects, but one of them is where that site of action is. So if the site of action is quite close to the top of the skin, then you have a better chance of getting it in than if it's deeper down. Some actives have particular physicochemical properties. So some people might have heard about the 500 Dalton rule, which is basically just that things that are smaller can get into skin more easily in general. There are things that are bigger that can get in more easily. It's to do with all sorts of things. There's things like polarity. It's complicated. It depends. Now, in terms of marketing, the marketing is quite tricky because cosmetics aren't drugs, so they can't really claim to change the structure or function of the body or treat a disease. And the specifics of what different products can and can't claim really depends on the region, but in general, that is the rule. That's the case even if there is scientific evidence that it does work. So, a lot of products do need to undersell themselves so that they're not getting in trouble with the law, so that they don't have to file a new drug application, for example. But then there are other products that oversell. So, for example, there are products that form a film over, I guess, like saggier parts of skin, things like under eye bags, and they just form a film and flatten it out. You'll see that they have more of a claim that sounds like it's doing something longer lasting, but really it is just a temporary effect. So it is quite tricky as a consumer to try to work out what exactly is what you're looking for in a product.
And then moving on to something specific, are actives not effective in moisturizer formats?
Yeah, so this is a myth I've seen around, and the answer is they can be. It really depends on the active and the moisturizer formula. So, moisturizers aren't really that much different from serums or other forms that are generally sold as like more active products. Really, what you need in your product is just some sort of base that helps the active get into skin. So, there are actually lots of topical medications or drugs that are in a moisturizer base, so things like tretinoin, tazarotene, hydroquinone, antifungal creams, all of these are usually in a cream base, and those have obviously been proven to work because drugs need to have evidence of efficacy before they get approved as drugs. So it's not like just because something's called a moisturizer or a cream, that means that it's not going to work. It depends so much on the overall formula.
So maybe you can do a speed run of ingredients that don't work, at least based off of the evidence that we currently have.
There are so many ingredients that don't have very much evidence that they work. I've gone through a bunch of the data on these in my long form content, but like if we really speed through some of the ones that have been trending lately, first off, rosemary oil to prevent hair loss. The evidence on this is just really bad. So the peer-reviewed studies, there are signs of fraud. The main study that people tend to refer to, it's a clinical trial and the numbers in it just do not make sense. For example, the averages are actually calculated incorrectly. You can literally whip out a calculator and try to calculate it and you'll see that the numbers are not correct. There are also errors in it that point to it being written by someone who doesn't actually know the topic. So there was a bit which says they rated the boldness according to the Hamilton rating scale for depression, which is a different rating scale. The rating scale they meant was the Hamilton scale for boldness. This was written in like 2015, which means that it was before ChatGPT. So it looks like someone manually wrote the complete wrong thing. And that to me really points to it being written as part of a paper mill. So, paper mills are things in publishing where they'll pump out papers and then they'll offer people to just stick their name on it for a fee. And this is a really big problem. I think it's in particular parts of the world, it's more of a problem, but there are researchers who have been combing through a lot of the evidence and finding all this evidence. And I didn't mention this in my video, but one of the authors, the corresponding author, he's actually published hundreds of papers in a year, which is not a normal level of output. And that again points to it being possibly part of a paper mill. There was also a rat study on rosemary oil. I was quite proud of finding this. It's actually got photoshopped images, so you'll see the same mice in two different treatment groups. Supposedly, it was tested with nothing and also rosemary oil. You can see the markings on the mouse are like too similar to not be the same mouse. There are also cell photos that are duplicated. They've been like cropped and like stretched out. Yeah, there is a lot of fraud in the literature, so peer review papers just can't really be taken at face value, along with things like papers that are so flawed that they're essentially useless. There is an estimate from a researcher called John Carlisle that at least 25% of clinical trials are fatally flawed or fraudulent. And often you can't actually see these problems without going through the raw data, which actually isn't accessible. So I think it is really important to think about, apart from just looking for clinical trial evidence, also thinking about the fundamental science of how a molecule works, and also looking for replication of the clinical trials by different groups. And also thinking about how many studies have probably been done on an ingredient that haven't been published, which is another big issue with peer-reviewed papers. It's called publication bias. It's just a lot easier to publish something that has positive results. One example of this is another ingredient that's trending, tranexamic acid. I am working on a long-form video on this, but the short version is based on its physical properties. Like, it's very polar. It's probably not going to penetrate skin well. And then it's also exactly the sort of ingredient that you would expect a lot of people to be researching. It's taken orally as a popular melasma treatment, it's cheap, it's widely used for other purposes. But then the research that has been published is just super underwhelming. There are very few trials where it's been tested alone. There are just tons of issues with those trials. And so, just based on that, it's probably not super likely to work. Another one is bakuchiol. This has been really overhyped as like a retinol alternative, but there isn't that much evidence that it works. The evidence that shows that it works is kind of weird. There's like a thing called a volcano plot, which isn't really what people usually use to show that something works. And the clinical studies on it have things like bakuchiol was used twice a day, but retinol was used once a day. So I think a lot of it is really clever marketing. Like, having it branded as a retinol alternative just makes it sound so much cooler than, I don't know, glycolic acid, which has very similar sort of results. So if glycolic acid was branded as a retinol alternative, maybe that would have sold a lot better as well. There's also a big thing about it being so-called pregnancy safe. Honestly, I think it's a lot of marketing as well. So first off, retinol isn't really a big problem if you use it in pregnancy based on the evidence. It's usually just recommended that you avoid it out of a super precautionary measure. And then on the flip side, bakuchiol is just too new to have been studied properly in pregnancy. It is probably safe, but you can't really guarantee that it's safe in pregnancy. And honestly, I think a lot of brands are probably going a bit beyond what they have the evidence for when they do claim that it is pregnancy safe.
These brands are probably just asking for a class action lawsuit to go against them because you can't prove that. And I guess a lot of the things that you were saying is just speaking to the need for critically assessing research. You can't just trust a paper just because it's published. Okay, the last question is, well, on the flip side, what are some ingredients that do work? But also, just because there's evidence, does that mean that they'll work in the formula?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've kind of answered that last bit already. But basically, ingredients that do work, usually they're the ones that are really boring, that you've heard a lot about already. So things like retinol, alpha hydroxy acids, vitamin C, vitamin B, niacinamide, hydroquinone, all the drugs obviously have lots of evidence behind them, tretinoin, tazarotene, adapalene, things like that. In terms of the formula, no. So everything depends a lot on the formula. Different things get delivered better by different sorts of formulas. So personally, when I'm looking for products, I look for products with actives that can potentially work. They have evidence behind them, but I also look for evidence that they work in that particular formula. So I look for things like clinical testing claims on the product reviews saying that it works really well, and also just trying it on my own skin.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That's all for this fireside chat, and it's now time for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that fireside chat. And to kick off the Q&A, our first question is from Emmy, who asks, what are your thoughts on PHA?
I think, I don't know. So PHA is polyhydroxy acid. It's like there are two chemical exfoliants that are polyhydroxy acids. And personally, I feel like on my skin, it's comparable to alpha hydroxy acids and beta hydroxy acid. The data looks like it's better, but it's very biased data. It's from the people who discovered it and have been promoting it. And anecdotally, I don't know if people have really seen that much of a difference or that much of a benefit over alpha hydroxy acids or beta hydroxy acids. So, yeah, I don't know. It's one of the ones where I feel like you would have to try on your skin and see.
The next question comes from Shira, who asks, well, can you talk about breastfeeding, pregnancy, and the use of retinoids?
Yeah, so this is quite, I don't know, I feel like with a lot of things to do with pregnancy and babies, there's just a lot of rules that aren't really entirely logical. They're always like overly cautious. So, first off, for breastfeeding, I think everyone universally agrees it's fine because the stage where vitamin A derivatives can impact a baby, it's very early on. So by the time they're out of your body, like it's completely fine. Now with pregnancy, so the whole caution comes from oral isotretinoin, and Dr. Jean Chan is going to talk more about this in her talk, which is coming up later, so hang out for that. But in general, things that go on our skin, especially if they're cosmetic retinoids that aren't going to do as much as a drug retinoid, they're probably going to be safe. A lot of doctors and health websites say, just to be cautious, then don't use them. I think it's up to you, but I think the most important thing is I get a lot of messages from people asking me, like, I accidentally used a dab of retinol, or like I used a sunscreen with retinol palmitate really low down in the ingredients. Have I done something terrible? And the stress and the worry of that is probably going to do more than like the tiny, tiny amount that might make it through your skin. So, yeah, I think chill out a bit, I think.
The next question is from Deepa Skin, who asks, can you talk about the concentration versus total amount
Hmm.
of a molecule applied, for example, 2 times 5% versus 1 times 10% niacinamide?
Yeah, this is a really good question because, yeah, it shouldn't make a difference. I think the main thing is really in studies, they just give out 10% or 5%, and then they let people use it according to the instructions. So those results are just with that percentage, with how people normally use it. Now, if you use a really tiny amount versus if you use a massive amount compared to the normal person, then your results are going to be like towards like the edges of the sort of distribution. But yeah, like if you use 2 times 5% versus 1 times 10%, it should be the same. Of course, the formula will be different though. So yeah, it's really difficult to say, but they should, in theory, all else being equal, give you the same result.
Another retinal question. This is from Koniat. I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name. Can you speak to the idea of retinol causing dry eyes because it destroys our meibomian glands?
Yeah, so this has been like a trending topic. In terms of the evidence, it seems like oral isotretinoin, so Accutane, Roaccutane, that can definitely have permanent effects. And some people have been feeling dry eyes from using tretinoin or retinol close to their eyes. I don't think the evidence is really there yet, and especially the evidence isn't there for how much it might affect your eyes, like what percentages, how close you can apply it to your eyes, what sorts of things you can do to try to stop it from going into your eyes. But it seems to be a largely permanent effect. So um, I think as retinol users, of course, you can stop using it completely if you don't want to run that risk. But I think if you aren't really sure and you just want to be a bit cautious, just maybe keep an eye on it. Like make sure if you feel any dry eyes, you know to stop immediately. And then that will limit any further damage. In terms of things you can do to prevent it, in theory, a lot of the things like applying Vaseline around your eyes or keeping it away from the eye area, that kind of thing, in theory should work. But again, the evidence just isn't really there yet to really say for sure.
This next question comes from Mita. I had to ask it because it's something that bothers me when I see brands doing this. But what are your thoughts on brands calling out actives based on the data extrapolated from the actives marketing sheets from ingredient suppliers, but not testing for those claims on the finished goods? So just because there's ingredient data, does that mean that it's going to work? And also, should we trust the ingredient data? What's up with that?
This is a very complicated question. So, for those of you who don't know what this is on about, so when a brand makes a product, a lot of the time they don't do their own research on the active ingredient. They're relying on data from the ingredient company who are selling the ingredient, and then the brands come in, they see the data, and then they put that ingredient in their products. Now, a lot of the time, when the ingredient company is selling the ingredient, they'll give out sheets of data showing like, oh, we put it like 20% into a cream-based formula, and these are the results we got. Like, I know people saw 50% decrease in their wrinkles after 3 weeks or something. And then sometimes the brand will then just plop 20% into their product as well and then just make that claim. That is pretty unethical, I think, because the formulation makes such a big difference. You don't know if it's actually going to have that same effect in your formulation, because usually when the ingredient suppliers make their formula, it's like the most basic formula, very plain. Usually when a brand makes the formula, they'll have the 20%, then they'll have like other stuff in there as well. It will be different formula. So I don't think it's ethical. I don't think it's justified. And I wish regulations would actually check that kind of thing a bit more. Now, in terms of whether they can trust the ingredient data from the ingredient supplier, yeah, so sometimes as a consumer, if you Google, if you look up some, I think there are some science communicators who are like using ingredient data in their content and like making the claims. The problem is like it varies so much. Some ingredient suppliers, they seem to have pretty robust data. Some ingredient suppliers or some like bigger brands, in fact, they'll publish papers on their results, like peer-reviewed papers, and that is fairly reliable. But then some of them are so sus. If you've ever seen some of my content on like critically analyzing things, yeah, ingredient supply data like has so many sus things in it. They'll change the axes of the graphs to make them look bigger. They'll have really bad controls, like they'll just have really poorly designed studies that are clearly meant to just make the ingredient look good. And because they're not, I guess in theory, the brands could sue the ingredient suppliers for false advertising. But I don't think that risk is as much as brands are getting because they have, thousands, possibly millions of customers. So they tend to be less careful with their claims, I think. And yeah, I would take them with a really big grain of salt. Every time I talk about ingredient supply data in my content, I'm always like, this is like extremely, like, do not take this too seriously. But I think some people do make it sound more reliable than it is, because it does look impressive. Like it's always lots of graphs, lots of numbers, lots of like, I guess, very sciencey looking stuff. Yeah, anyway, all of that to say, you can trust it. Oh, yeah, you can't trust it that much. I would probably trust brands that are quoting peer-reviewed articles saying like 2% niacinamide does whatever. Again, you do have to separate the fact that it is in a different formulation, and don't take that percentage. Like you can't really equate them quite that confidently. But yeah, ingredient suppliers are like a whole level worse.
And you'll hear more about the formulation context from Lanesa and Mahon later in this chat, or later in this camp. And I also wanted to say to Cosmetic Ciral, I'm sorry, I've totally butchered your name, but you asked that how can scientists do that kind of fake data? Isn't it bad for their careers or even legally? I just wanted to say, because we don't have time to answer this, but we actually have a fact sheet about how to read science, and a lot of the answers to your question are in there. And I also wanted to say finally that we're also keeping track of your questions. So if they're not answered here, then stay tuned. We'll try to cover them on our Instagram page as well. And that's all the time we have for this fireside chat, and it's now time for the next one.
So I'm here with Barae Jomaa, who is a toxicologist from Colonial Chemical, and we're going to be doing the Safety 101 for the fireside chats at this camp. And I guess to get this conversation started, my first question to you, are products on the market safe?
In a nutshell, I would say they are. Historically, that is what has been proven the case. There are very few incidents of cosmetics actually causing an adverse health effect. And why are they safe? Because they're regulated. The onus of responsibility is on the manufacturer of these cosmetic products. And it's a very big responsibility. So if anything happens, that is going to be the issue that's going to come back and hit those manufacturers. So they do their best really to make sure that these cosmetics are safe and also that they comply with the regulations. And this regulation, what the companies have to do is that they have to conduct cosmetic product safety assessment. So this is done within a report, and this report that the companies do, these manufacturers do, is going to include a toxicological profile of all the individual raw materials, impurities, and you also look at the level of exposure given the use that you have. So depending on the use, what is the foreseeable use and what is the associated level of exposure. When you have all of that together, then you can conduct an overall risk assessment and see, are these effects that have been identified, are they controlled? Is the risk deemed minimal? And therefore, can I say that the product is actually going to be safe? Usually a toxicologist will do this kind of work. Importantly as well is that when people are using cosmetics, there's kind of a fail-safe. You use a cosmetic, and if anything happens to you, you can go to a certain website and report to your manufacturer, give them an email. They're going to reach out to you. It's the responsibility of the cosmetic producer then to reach out to the authorities and say, hey, I've had this adverse effect reported and this is the issue. You then follow up and see, why did this issue happen? It could be an ingredient, it could be a batch. Then you have to trace back that batch. Most of the times could be effects that are maybe not going to occur to the general public. So there are people that are going to be maybe overly sensitive to certain substances, and that's nothing that is possible to avoid.
There's so many ingredients that come up every month, seemingly, with media headlines that you need to be worried about XYZ. PFAS lately, phthalates or parabens come up. I mean, maybe not as much anymore because companies aren't using them as much anymore because of whatever. How should people be thinking about these controversial ingredients that come up in headlines, just generally?
I think generally it has to do perhaps with the previous question that you asked. So there has to be a general sense that there are mechanisms in place that look into these topics. And there are a lot of people out there that are looking into this. There are governments, there are industry organizations, there are companies themselves, it could be NGOs. Everybody has a stake in this, and everybody wants to get to the bottom of these issues. If there is usually a substance that has been found to cause certain adverse effects, the governments are going to usually either restrict it or ban it, and companies are going to directly remove it from their products because they don't want to have any substances in their products that possibly could be hurting their customers. The customer is king, and they want to make sure that their customers are returned customers and they're going to be happy with the product. When you're looking at things like PFAS, it's something it has more to do with the fact that these kind of fluorine carbon bonds are very strong, and it's going to be persistent in the environment. So before I start worrying perhaps about the health effects, you're going to find an overall ban eventually of these substances because of their persistence. So they're not disappearing from the environment, and that is going to be the primary driver of their phasing out eventually. Many expect that phase out to occur by 2025, by next year, very soon, and the industry is also behind that move. There are effects to some PFAS. Now, PFAS is, we talk about PFAS, we talk about phthalates. I mean, these are just groups of substances, and especially PFAS, it's 10,000 plus substances. When we say that there's an effect, it's actually, you can only say there's an effect to substance X, Y, or Z. You cannot say they're all going to be toxic to reproduction. You're going to mention some of the PFAS substances that have been found to be toxic to reproduction. And again, the thread here, the binding element between all the PFAS is actually, on a molecular level, this carbon-fluorine bond. What kind of connects all of these substances together is their persistence. Look at the news, but also consider that what I often find is that sometimes they go either way. They're either trying to make things sound fantastic. They want to get that click. They want to make things sound maybe deadly or horrendous. But in fact, the reality is much more nuanced. There could be some substances in a group that are bad, some maybe are not. So you have to be able to understand that difference and to be able to trust eventually the companies making these cosmetics. On the other end, you might have some parties, I think, that are saying there's no concern at all without even thinking about it. And I think that's why it's important. And that's why many companies have toxicologists that are not, they're not salespeople. Toxicologists are actually going to look at things very factually and try to find a solution based on experiments, in vitro experiments, because, we're not testing on animals.
I guess with many of the popular headlines that gain a lot of traction, I find there's often this conflation between hazard and risk. Barae, could you explain the difference between hazard and risk?
Hazards are certain adverse effects that we find by testing. So the way these tests are conducted is that you take a substance and you run a concentration range. So you have very little of that substance, a bit more, a bit more, a bit more, to like very high levels. You're going to find out sort of where there's an effect. Most things have an effect. At one point, it's going to be maybe cytotoxicity, so it's not specific to maybe the endpoint you're looking at. But you might have a lot of times where there is an effect. Let's say irritation. Irritation will occur at a certain concentration, for example, for a certain class of substances like surfactants, because surfactants will tend to have that effect. The question is, what is the concentration when it's having that effect? Therefore, is that the concentration I'm using in my product, is it above or below that? And that is risk. So if I'm using a substance in my product below the effect level, then there's no risk. If I'm using it above that level, that means I'm going to have irritation. That means that there is a risk. So then I have to reformulate. I have to put in less of that substance. And what you can do, for example, with surfactants is that you can put mixtures of surfactants, and then their combination is actually sometimes going to have the interesting effect that's going to, create less irritation than you would have expected because they interact with each other.
My final question to you is, from your point of view as a toxicologist, what are the top safety misconceptions out there?
There's no such thing that is toxic free. Now, there's a lot of talk about toxic free environments, toxic free this, toxic free that. Everything is toxic at some point. And, the job of professionals in the industry that are really stewards of your safety is to make sure that there is no risk to you as a consumer. Of course, we're not going to be including substances that are carcinogenic, mutagenic, or reproductive toxicants. I mean, that's the first thing we do, actually, to make sure that such substances are not in there. But then when you look at maybe some effects such as irritation, that's when we look at, okay, so is the level contained? Are we having a substance that's not going to cause irritation to the customer, but still going to do its effect? So we want to find that balance. So there is no such thing as toxic free. Water can be toxic. Everything around you can be toxic. So don't fall for that. Think of it realistically, be objective. All substances will be toxic. The food you eat can be toxic if you consume too much of it. Trust the companies to make sure that your products are safe to use based on the use that you're having. And another thing that you have to really take care of is that you're using your products as they're being intended to be used. And another thing is, I guess there's maybe a misconception that cosmetics don't expire, and they do. So, do use your cosmetics within their expiration date, because I've been guilty of that. I've gone to my drawer of cosmetics, and I know I've bought some wonderful cosmetics ages ago, and then I think, oh my gosh, I'm going to go into that drawer and use that thing. I haven't used it for months, and then I put it on. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's irritating me. It never did before, and that's because at that point that cosmetic probably broke down into substances that were not intended to be in that product. So if you have an expired product, or a product that has been sitting in your drawer for a very long time, I advise you not to use it.
That's the end of our Safety 101, and it's now time for Q&A.
So we have a bunch of really good questions about safety now. Our first question is from Mita, who asks, what are your thoughts on tea tree oil being classified as reprotoxic?
Well, if the classification is for reproductive toxicity, that means that there has been a weight of evidence that was put out there, showing that effect. It's not that a substance is natural, that it is without any harm. And that is something to keep in mind. We have a lot of substances around us that are going to be negative to our health, or potentially negative to our health. So we have to keep that in mind. And I think in the EU, with a lot of the oncoming testing for endocrine disruption, which is going to be more frequently tested in the coming future, we're going to find out actually a lot of more substances are probably going to be classified or suspected of being endocrine disruptors. And the big question is, so maybe if they're modulating an endocrine response, so we have maybe some effect on the hormone levels or disruption of modulation of hormone stability. does that mean that you get an adverse health effect? And that these are two different questions. And then what you need to do in those cases is try to, fill in the data in between. When you get the classification at the very end of the day for reproductive toxicity, it means that the full testing has been done. So you should go with that. Yeah.
I don't know if you can answer this one because I think it is based around US cosmetics, but or
Mhm.
US drugs even. But from Mona Allen, how do cosmetic ingredients achieve GRAS status, so generally recognized as safe?
Um, I can't tell you that, but I know that it is not very usually strict in general. All these US regulations and GRAS notifications, it's not a very scientific process. And I would not just take a GRAS status for granted. I would look into it. I would make sure that the data supports it because some GRAS notifications can be just one-sided.
Another question from Germ Element.
Mhm.
In what ways can fear-mongering about ingredients affect public health and regulations?
Yeah, it does affect regulations quite a bit, and it is okay, I think. It's kind of this interplay between the producers, the regulators, and the NGOs. That's always at play, and there's this dance that happens, and everybody keeps everybody in check. The companies are providing the regulators with information to defend their case, and the NGOs and the public are usually not bringing any information. They're just bringing fears. And, with this dynamic, then you end up with an outcome, which is a decision as to whether a substance is needs to be restricted or shouldn't be restricted. Sometimes the restrictions are precautionary because there might be some potential indications and there's public concern. Um, Sometimes these actions are taken ahead of the curve, and it can come also with the customers themselves moving away from certain substance. So if the customers are not themselves buying products with a certain substance, then the market has spoken. Unfortunately, in some cases it might be unfortunate, and others it might be later on proven to be justified. Yeah.
So I guess sort of a related question, and I'm probably going to elaborate on this because I'm really curious. From Cosmetic Solari, should we avoid ingredients that are potential endocrine disruptors or carcinogens? And I wanted to add to that because there are
Mm,
so many news stories about like these might be endocrine disruptors, these other things might be. And then you see things like the EU will ban something and then the US will not. I guess like as a consumer,
mm.
at what point like would you personally recommend that we start looking out for a particular ingredient, for example?
That's a good question. So there's in the world of carcinogenicity, I think it is pretty broad. So you have some regulators that might be more strict. Some institutions might be more strict. Thinking IARC and California Proposition 65. And California Proposition 65 usually takes most of its data from IARC. And a lot of times those decisions are not necessarily using the most up-to-date data. So I would see those on one side of the court. There are those kind of extreme uh, precautionary kind of persons or institutions. They want to label your coffee. It's going to contain acrylamide. You shouldn't drink too much coffee. You should be careful. We all drink coffee, we know that, and even if it does contain acrylamide, eventually it's overall over your lifetime, it's actually better for your health because it also contains antioxidants. So everything it should be taken with a grain of salt. When I'm looking at the different sort of regulations, looking at the U.S., the Canada, and the EU, the theme that comes out of that when I look at it is that the U.S. is it regulates maybe coloring agents, but in other for other things, they're not very um, I guess thorough. There's the method even with MOCRA. That's a very good step. I mean, MOCRA is coming closer to what the EU is doing, so I think I welcome that wholeheartedly. I think this should have been done years ago. But sort of, it is moving closer to where it should be, the US. Canada has been somewhere in between. I think they're often following what happens in the EU. So if something's restricted in the EU, you will see it's being eventually restricted also in Canada. You will see it on the Canadian cosmetics hot list. So that's that. And in terms of the endocrine disruption, that's what do carcinogenicity, if it is a proven carcinogen in the EU, not necessarily on IARC or these kind of lists maybe that are non-governmental, I would not necessarily take it as a fact. But if you're finding it as a carcinogen listed in the EU chemicals regulation, I would take it pretty seriously. And then if it is a genotoxic carcinogen, so it is actually able to affect your genes, then it's maybe not a good idea to have it. Definitely not as an ingredient. That should not be ever the case. And as an impurity, you should make sure that these impurities are at a technically unavoidable level, and there is a sort of accepted risk level for cancer. Let's say 1 in a million in your lifetime. That's there's going to be an accepted level, and a toxicologist will be able to make that calculation to see, okay, so maybe I might have an impurity, and no substances without impurities. If we're going to take something from the ground, we're going to have a bunch of heavy metals that come with it. So you cannot avoid hazardous or toxic substances altogether. Eventually, you have to calculate your risk. Is it an accepted risk? And did I do my best as a company that is either a manufacturer of raw materials or as a formulator making cosmetic ingredients? Did I do my best to make sure that carcinogenic, mutagenic, and reproductive toxicants are there at the most minimal level, at technically unavoidable levels? That's the question you should ask yourself. And I don't know if we have time to continue. I can go on about this, especially endocrine disruption. Just let me know if there's time.
Yeah, we've got a bit of time.
Yeah. Okay. So for endocrine and reproductive toxicity, that is going to be also about how much you have of the substance, perhaps more so than carcinogens, because there is no safe level really of a substance that's going to be genotoxic, because these will add up and they will create it's a linear relationship. They're going to create some kind of effect potentially down the line. With reproductive toxicants, you might have this uh, more threshold where that you might have to reach, and then you can try to be below that threshold, and that should not be a problem. And that is definitely okay. We will see substances in our food that might be bad for our endocrine system. It doesn't mean that we stop eating it. It just means that it is present at such a low amount that really does not affect us, and our bodies are more than able to deal with it. Even with cancer, again, genotoxicity is a no-go, but some carcinogenic effects could be more mechanical. It could be dose related. If you have a lot of it, how are you exposed? If you're getting something, you're breathing a certain substance and it does mechanical effects in your lungs and therefore produce carcinogenic effect, then you know um, don't put it in a product that's going to be inhaled. Um, and yeah, so that's it. And especially for endocrine disruption, I think there's a lot more discussion that's going to happen, a lot more testing. One of the big topics that's going to be occurring really is about the amount of animals that we might need to use to kind of reach that solution. And I think us as individuals and as companies, we have to push back uh, on extensive animal testing, because in vitro alternatives should be able to replace testing in animal, because as you might have heard in many situations, uh, a rat is not is not equal to a human being, and therefore when you sometimes test in a cell line coming from human, you will have data that is more representative actually of the actual effect than testing it in another organism, in another species. So that is something to keep in mind. I don't know if there are other questions. Maybe I should leave there space for other questions. Yeah.
Well, I think we might have run out of time, actually. Thank you
Okay.
so much
Hmm.
for all your
Sure.
insights. That was really, really interesting. To our audience, please put your questions into the chat and we'll move on to the next talk now.
So welcome to the Formulation chat with Lanesa Mahon, who is a PhD student at the University of Cincinnati. And just to quickly kickstart this conversation, my first question to you is, what's up with combining ingredients in formulations? Is there synergy? And if so, when? And how do we think about this in the context of formulation versus layering or cocktailing products?
There is absolutely nothing wrong with combining certain ingredients in formulation and using products with different active ingredients. The issue is that a lot of times what we see with some powerful actives is that they can be irritating. So when we're talking about like cocktailing and layering products, you have to really think about your skincare goals, what you're looking to see, what you're looking to observe, what is going to complement that. There is plenty of places where you can find synergy. Like, for example, one type of formula is like a rinse off product. You have anionic surfactants, you have amphoteric surfactants, and they can both be somewhat harsh on their own. But when you combine them together and you make a mixed micelle, they can be even more milder than both of them would be individually. There's also like kind of biological or mechanistic synergy. So, for example, with a hyperpigmentation product, right? Looking for different ways to target that hyperpigmentation. So, stopping tyrosinase activity, stopping melanosome transfer, and then increasing skin cell turnover to get rid of the deposited melanosomes. There are plenty of ways that synergy can be achieved within a product.
How do we think about this in the context of formulation versus layering or cocktailing of products? I'm also kind of interested in getting at like, well, just because there's a bunch of active ingredients that have evidence doesn't necessarily mean they'll perform based off of the formulation context.
When we're talking about in a formulation, you can put multiple active ingredients in there that can complement each other. For example, like if you're using an acid or a retinoid and you're in combining that with soothing ingredients. So those can be used together to improve the user experience. In terms of layering, however, you want to be a little bit more careful with layering certain products. Like an acid with another acid and then layering maybe a retinoid on that might not be the best thing to do, because all of those have kind of similar functions in terms of increasing skin cell turnover that can lead to irritation. When we're talking about like layering or adding multiple active ingredients into something, we really just need to think about what we need. Just because a product has multiple active ingredients in it doesn't mean that it's going to work, just because there are certain parameters of a formulation that can affect performance. When I talk about actives, and I talked about this in my e-summit, it's about getting the right active to the right place at the right time and the right concentration. That doesn't always happen. And there are a lot of different formulation parameters that can affect the delivery of that active and the efficacy of that active.
Yeah, and I guess from the layering perspective, this is complicated because just because two products even have data around it doesn't mean you're going to have like a complementary or additional benefit from the products, because that evidence is based off of one product and maybe not layering of two products. So what happens then? Hard to say.
Yeah, it is hard to say. Sometimes I feel like people especially overdo it with actives, or they overlayer, and it will actually end up being more of a negative effect in the end, because you're just doing too much. Too much of a good thing is a bad thing. When we're talking about layering products and we're layering multiple actives and putting multiple actives on, we really need to think about like, what are we trying to achieve? What are these individual actives like? What are they doing? And do I need all of this?
Does the percentage of an active mean that the product will work in the way that we expect? So, for example, we know that X percentage of vitamin C has clinical data on it. Does that mean that it'll work, but also does higher percentage mean better? From a formulation context, similar to the first question, How do we think about this?
A higher percentage of an active does not exactly mean that it will work. There are so many components of a formulation that matter when we're talking about active delivery, active stability. So vitamin C is a really good example. You could have 10% vitamin C and you don't have anything to stabilize that vitamin C. It's inactive. So you can have that 10%. That doesn't mean that 10% is going to do anything for your skin. Just because active is at a higher concentration doesn't mean necessarily that it's going to be more effective. For example, retinol is pretty powerful at low concentrations, and once you up that concentration past a certain point, you could see irritation, you could see negative effects. It is really kind of a balancing act. You don't need to have 10% of everything to see an effect. Sometimes like 5% will be fine. But you also don't want to see certain things be too low. For niacinamide, for example, 5% niacinamide, I could see that and I'd be like, all right, that might be effective. Whereas if I saw like 0.5% niacinamide, I'd be like, what am I going to get from that? So it all just depends on a case by case basis.
Kind of to throw a curveball in some of the things that we were talking about, what are the real reasons why people, more often than not, are actually liking the products that they're using? Is it the actives or is it something else?
I feel like it's very person dependent. Everybody likes different things. There's a sensorial aspect to cosmetics that some people might like something, some people might not. Like I love snail mucin. I have people that think snail mucin feels awful and it's sticky and slimy. I will say there are certain products where I would say skin type might have a little bit more of an influence on how you perceive a product. If you have really dry skin and say you're looking for a sunscreen, if you have really dry skin, you might want to have a more nourishing and moisturizing type of sunscreen formulation. But, somebody with naturally oily skin might not like that. So there's a lot of subjectivity when it comes to products. In actives, everybody has different tolerance. I tolerate retinoids and acids very, very well. Other people might have more sensitive skin, so that might not be the best product for them. So instead of an AHA, they might want to use a PHA.
Yeah. And I guess another angle that I was thinking about when I asked this question is with respect to like emulsions, as one example. People get a lot out of the sensory aspect for how it rubs in, how it feels. And so I find that a lot of people feel that that's due to things that it's not. Ultimately, it's often due to the emulsifier systems. And then the other thing that I was kind of getting at with this question with respect to fragrance, and this is also like kind of like the aesthetics kind of driving why people maybe reach for different products rather than the others. Because if you go and test some hair care products that can have all the efficacy in the world and it doesn't smell nice to the users, if you go and actually do a consumer panel test, they'll reach for the fragrance product because they like the aesthetic attributes.
Cosmetics is all about sensorial aspects. And so some people they gravitate towards that sensorial aspect even if it's not necessarily efficacious. And other people are more focused on the efficacy of product and not so much the sensorial aspect. Whether you like a product or not is very person dependent. Sometimes people like products, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's good or that it's doing good things. So, for example, like cleansing, right? A lot of people like a harsh cleanser because they like that dry and tight kind of feeling because they feel clean. They like that squeaky feeling. They feel squeaky clean. If they have something, and I think we saw this like with the CeraVe hydrating cleanser, they didn't have a foamy cleanser. And so people felt like they weren't getting clean, so they didn't like it. It is really very person dependent whether you'll like a product or not.
How would you recommend, as a cosmetic chemist, looking for good formulations or good products for consumers? How do you go about finding products?
I used to really rely on like skin type. It used to be, oh, skin type, I have oily skin. So now I've learned to think less about that and think about what my skin needs and what my skin concerns are. So that's really the first thing. Stop thinking about skin type and start thinking about skin concern. What do you want to see? What are your skincare goals? The next thing is, I would say, looking for actives with kind of like a strong body of evidence. Once again, it does not mean that that active is going to work in that formulation and upon application, but finding a tranexamic acid serum versus a niacinamide serum, like I would probably go for the niacinamide serum because in my opinion, tranexamic acid doesn't have as strong a body of evidence. Now, if I saw tranexamic acid in there with something else, then I would be more inclined to be like, all right, maybe. Really thinking about the evidence, thinking about what testing has been done on these products. That's another thing. Claims saying that this produced a X% improvement in this concern versus saying 95% of consumers like this. Truthfully, and this might be a little controversial, but a lot of the times finding a good product for you is trial and error. You can never really know how a product performs until you try it. There are things that you can look at, things that you can notice on an ingredient list. For example, if something says that you're getting the benefits from niacinamide and then you see niacinamide all the way at the end of the INCI list, you're probably going to be like, not the best product. It's not really going to give me that benefit. But trial and error is really kind of the biggest thing to finding products that you like.
And that's all the time we have for this fireside chat. And it's now time for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Lanesa, for that fireside chat. And I'll get right to the Q&A. The first question I'll ask is from Wenny, who asks, well, how do you formulate products with good efficacy using natural ingredients, but stable during stability testing? And maybe I'll reframe that a little bit of like, what are some of the challenges with working with natural materials and the dynamics of stability testing and stability in formulations?
Yeah, so natural ingredients. So first of all, when we're talking about natural ingredients, a lot of times we're talking about a combination of different ingredients. So it's really making sure that you have the correct stabilizers, antioxidants, things like that to ensure the integrity of your natural ingredients. They are a little bit difficult. They can be difficult to work with, but there are ways to create efficacious products with natural ingredients. But really, a lot of that has to do with once you make a formulation, you really have to test it. You need to test it for stability. You need to make sure that you're doing your accelerated stability testing and whatever other tests that you need to ensure that your product works. So it's kind of hard to say how you can formulate everything specifically, but it's more in testing that formula after it is formulated to ensure that it is going to remain stable and it does do what you say it's going to do or what you want it to do.
And now you just said a word, accelerated stability testing. Maybe like what does that look like and why does it tell us the things that it tells us and like what does it tell us?
So accelerated stability testing is having a formula at a higher temperature for a long or for a period of time. And that higher temperature is supposed to kind of accelerate the degradation or yeah, kind of accelerate the degradation. So it's usually done, I think, at like elevated temperature. I think it's like 40 over 40 degrees Celsius. And while accelerated stability testing can be nice to kind of like see if your formula will be stable and will hold up, there are certain things that happen at that 40-degree temperature that might not happen over the course of a normal shelf life. So that is kind of the gist of accelerated stability. Like it has its plus, but it also has its weaknesses.
Oh, me too. I really like this question. And it speaks to one of the questions that I got in my fireside chat, which is what are your thoughts on brands stating water and formulations are bad for the skin, or maybe even just like filler, cheap ingredients that are useless? And are waterless skincare products better?
Okay. Filler ingredients. I have a really big issue with, people's qualms against filler ingredients because, so much of a cosmetic product is the sensorial part, the aesthetics and like those filler ingredients, they can be very important to either, just the application of the product, the feel of the product, but they can also be important to the stability and integrity of the product. So like fillers are great and there's nothing wrong with having water in a formulation. I personally haven't tried any well, let me not say anhydrous because there are plenty of anhydrous products, but I haven't tried any of the water-free products, so to speak. So I can't really speak on how good or bad they are, but I just find them interesting, especially like a soap ball or like, the little soap packets or the shampoo packets that, don't have water. I struggle to envision the user experience on that. So I don't really, people saying that water is a filler, it's just we need fillers. Fillers have a purpose. Water has a purpose in your formula. So
And a lotion without water would probably not have nice sensory.
And
Yeah,
you know, because you need the water to hydrate your skin, sort of, you know, and then just put the water in the product is how I feel a lot of the time. Just put the water in the product.
the next question comes from Neural, who asks, are the clean and natural ingredients, claimed ingredients or DIY ingredients, safer than formulated ingredients in cosmetics? Well, clean and natural ingredients can be formulated into cosmetics. So maybe I'll just ask it as, are clean and natural ingredients safer in the context of cosmetic formulations? Because a lot of times these are in your DIY formulas as well. So that's how I'll refer the question.
So no, clean and natural does not equal better. Like poisonous, you know, poison ivy is natural and you know that's not exactly great for you. There are plenty of things that are natural that are not exactly great for you. Clean ingredients, from my experience in clean ingredients, what I feel is that these are ingredients a lot of the times that have existed for also a while, but they're not used in relation to other ingredients because maybe their sensorial properties are a little bit less, or maybe they're not as efficacious at what they do. So when it comes to clean ingredients, what I feel for clean ingredients is they claim it's safer, but the only reason they claim it's safer is because there's a smaller body of evidence on that safety, or maybe that safety hasn't been evaluated in as large of a population and stuff like that. So like other ingredients that are deemed kind of like dirty, like for example, sodium lauryl sulfate, SLES, like these are ingredients that have been used for decades, decades and decades. So they have decades of safety data and, you know, huge dockets of safety data. Whereas, you know, clean ingredients a lot of times are things that have been kind of repurposed, and you know they made them, it didn't really pick on, it didn't really catch on, and so now they're trying to use it because there is like less data to say this is unsafe. But I feel like with a lot of these clean ingredients, as we continue to use them, as they get more use, we'll kind of find that, you know, some of those safety concerns also exist with these ingredients as well. So I think it's just like the level of body of evidence that um, older ingredients have as compared to some of the newer clean ingredients. Not exactly that they're safer.
And I might be opening up too big of a can of worms with this last question that I'll ask is from Nessie Gang, who asks, is sodium cocoisethionate or sodium C1416 olefin sulfonate good alternatives to SLS? But maybe I'll also extend it of like, do we need these alternatives? Is there anything really wrong with SLS? Good alternative. I mean, you can have an alternative, but does that mean that it's going to be as efficacious or even as sustainable? I mean, what do you think?
So okay, I will not lie. I do really like sodium cocoa isethionate. I feel like when we're thinking about SLES, I think a lot of the times the utility of SLES with certain formulations is the fact that you can pair it with an amphoteric surfactant and it can kind of act as a delivery or deposition system. I believe that both SCI and the olefin sulfonate, I do believe that they both kind of have that ability to be paired. But they all have their utilities, like olefin sulfonates, they can accommodate more pH harsh ingredients. So like if you are doing like a cleanser with like an acid, a lot of the times like you might want to use an olefin sulfonate because there are certain ingredients that might not withstand the low pH. So it's kind of a case by case basis. I don't have an issue with sodium lauryl sulfate or the ether sulfates. I believe that they can be formulated in conjunction with other things to kind of address people's concerns about the mildness or the harshness of the ingredient. So it's really all about the formulation, but there's really no problem with any of those ingredients.
And if you want to learn a whole bunch more about surfactants, I actually, for my next podcast season, have a surfactant specific podcast. And we go into this in a whole bunch of detail. So stay tuned for that, the Equal podcast. But anyhow, that's all the time we have for this live Q&A. Thank you so much, Lanesa, for your time
Thank
for
you,
this.
Jen. I love doing this. So thank you so much for inviting me back.
Welcome to the regulatory misconception presentation. And for this one, we're joined by Kamal Kaur from the Cosmetics Regulator platform that Michelle and I both a big fan of on Instagram. Be sure to follow. And so my first question to you, Kamal, is what are some of the top regulation myths and misconceptions?
So trying to narrow this down, I usually see the same three coming up quite regularly. First one being that cosmetic products are not regulated, when in fact, actually, all cosmetic products do have regulatory processes that they must go through. Most importantly, they must be safe before they are launched onto the market. One that I see quite often, it's more like a grouped misconception, I would say, is that some cosmetic products are either better than others because they contain certain ingredients or certain groups of ingredients, whereas other products are worse than others because they contain the same groups of ingredients that the other ones are absent of. So I'm more leaning towards things like natural is better, free from preservatives, fragrances, synthetics, all of that sort of scaremongering around ingredients, when in fact the regulatory framework for every single cosmetic, especially in UK, EU, and the US is evolving, is that they all follow the same regulatory steps. So to say that one is better or safer to use than another is again completely untrue, because they have to go through rigorous processes before they are launched onto the market. We see it a lot with natural organic cosmetics. Actually, natural substances are hugely complex and contain a variety of substances that need to be managed in a very special way in the EU. They are, naturally complex substances. So to say they're natural, they're better, it's not always the case. Lastly, I would say one of the biggest misconceptions that I hear is that cosmetics that are in the EU are safer than any other cosmetics that you can buy, whether that be in Asia, in the US, in South America, which isn't the case, because all of these regions actually do have cosmetic regulations in place. Just because they don't necessarily list out 1,400 substances that the EU lists as being banned and not allowed to be used in cosmetics, that doesn't mean that all these other regions are allowing all of these substances in products. That's not the case. You will usually find that many of these substances would never really actually be found in cosmetics. EU is, it is the gold standard across the world. A lot of other markets are copying the EU. Doesn't mean that they're allowing all of these ingredients in their products. That's not usually the case. And again, for 99% of regions that do have cosmetic regulations in place, they do have to go through safety assessments before they are launched onto the market. And without that, it's unlikely a cosmetic product would launch. Obviously, there is the 1% of brands and products out there that may not necessarily follow these steps and may not necessarily follow the regulations, but you generally can tell from, even looking at a cosmetic as a consumer, whether it looks like it has gone through the processes. It's got a responsible person on there. It's got an ingredients list on there. There's some obvious markers. But to say that the EU cosmetics are safer than American cosmetics, for example, is completely untrue as well.
And then the next question is, well, first, what's the difference between a cosmetic and a drug? I think there's some confusion around what cosmetics can actually do or maybe claim. And then how can everyday consumers better spot the difference between drug and cosmetic claims?
So cosmetics generally can only claim to, improve the appearance of skin, hair, nails, eyelashes, etc. Clean, beautify the skin, make you smell nice, and they're generally used on the external skin, hair, nails, as I mentioned. Anything sort of claimed above and beyond this, so anything that would be claiming a physiological mode of action within the skin, so any sort of internal use of a product, anything that is claiming to cure, diseases, illnesses, medical conditions, that would take you out of the realms of a cosmetic, and you'd start to be looking at OTC, so over-the-counter drugs in the US, and then medicines in UK, EU, and perhaps natural health products as well in Canada, which fall under sort of the OTC umbrella. I think one of the ways that consumers can sort of tell the difference when looking at, two products on the shelf, for example, there's a couple of, I guess, giveaways on packaging. Have a look at how the ingredients list is presented. Is it all ingredients followed by a full list of ingredients? Has there been one specific ingredient that's been called out as the active ingredient? In that case, it's more likely that the product is a medicine or an OTC. If all the ingredients have sort of been lumped together in a list, that looks more like a cosmetic inky list than a medicinal one. Have a look at the type of product it is. Is it just a simple moisturizer claiming to, hydrate the skin? Is it a cleanser just claiming to cleanse the skin and make the skin look better? Or is it trying to claim to reduce acne, prevent hair loss? Is it something that is actually going to need more of a stronger effect, basically, to have that benefit? That will usually lead you to think that is more of a medicine or a medicinal mode of action than your simple moisturizers, makeup, cleansers. Obviously, there is some skincare out there that is doing more than you can claim, and that is a big topic in the industry at the moment, whereby cosmetic innovation is sort of being stifled a little bit because of that, because we can only claim so much. But have a look at what the intended function is, what the claims look like, and more importantly, what does that ingredient list look like? Is it separated out? Is it all lumped together? And that should help a consumer to understand what cosmetic might be versus medicines.
I will say, to throw a little bit of a wrench in that, because sometimes companies are calling out specific actives, like, for example, this contains 2% hyaluronic acid. Often those medicinal claims are in this like white box where or maybe not, okay, but they usually say medicinal. There's usually something like that on it, whereas like hyaluronic acid, something else. I think, like, if you really care, you could go and look for monographs. You could just like Google, does this have a monograph related to this claim? Because hyaluronic acid does not have a monograph. And I'm just saying this because sometimes some brands overblow the claims that they're able to make and then toe the line to start making drug claims. And it's just something for me. If I see a brand doing that, I just won't want to support them.
Definitely. And I think in the US as well, it's even more obvious if a product is a OTC or a drug, because you have the drug facts label on the back. If you see that, then that is telling you it is more of an OTC drug. It's not classified as a cosmetic. Whereas in the UK, it's not as obvious. You do still have your active ingredient on there, but there is usually a PL number, so product license number, which is associated with medicines. But that's usually very, very tiny on the back, and they might still be making claims, like you say, around hyaluronic acid on the front as well.
Oh, and DIN numbers. DIN numbers, and in Canada we have NPN numbers. Okay, and then my final question to you. This is kind of along the lines of, we're talking about cosmetics and drugs. Well, then there's this third category that people talk about, which is medical grade. Is medical grade skincare a thing, or is it just another cosmetic product?
It is another cosmetic product. 9 times out of 10. Medical grade skincare and cosmeceuticals have no regulatory definition within US, UK, EU, Canada. Medical grade, it insinuates that the product, it can do more than your standard cosmetic, but that's not always the case. Usually your product is a cosmetic or a medicine. A product can never be both. It cannot follow two different sets of rules. It cannot follow two different sets of label rules, claim rules, and two different sets of regulatory processes, registration processes. It's just not possible. The reason I say 9 times out of 10 is because that one might be an actual medicine, but it is skincare. It's maybe a dermally applied cream for eczema, for example. That would then be medical skincare, but you would know that because it will probably have the drug facts label on the back, so you know if it's a medicine. Again, that doesn't mean it's medical grade skincare. That is a marketing claim, but it is medical skincare and it follows the medical regulations, whereas standard moisturizers, cleansers, shampoos, etc., they will all follow cosmetic regulations. So claiming medical grade is definitely a marketing term to insinuate that the product can do more than a cosmetic should be able to do. And it really does toe the line with claims and how brands communicate with their consumers. Consumers need to be able to understand what the product can do and make sure that they're getting the efficacy that they think they're getting, not something that has been overinflated because of a claim such as medical grade skincare.
And that's all the time we have for this presentation. Thank you so much, Kamal. And it's now time for Q&A.
So now we have some questions about regulations after that very interesting talk. So our first question is from Mita. With the EU being the gold standard for regulations and certain restrictions on inclusion levels, does that mean that the finished goods in other markets aren't safe?
Simple answer, no. It's a little bit more complex because it's not legal in any market around the world to actually place an unsafe product on the market. Just because it doesn't follow the EU standard, it doesn't mean it's not safe. When we say EU is gold standard, we mean they have a process in place for assessing ingredients, going through, industry actions, and also gaining the engagement and input from industry before making any regulatory changes. Not all markets do that. And with the EU, it covers everything when it comes to a cosmetic product, from the labeling, the ingredients, the chemical safety of the products. Not all regulations do that, but on the whole, globally, you can't sell a product on the market if it is not safe for the consumer, even if it follows a different regulatory framework.
A question from Narul. What are the actions taken if there are violations of regulations regarding cosmetics after it's marketed? Supposedly it's different for every country. And can the users take action due to any effects?
So it depends on which effects we're talking about. Are we talking about like an adverse event, perhaps a skin reaction, or a breach of regulations whereby the documentation perhaps isn't in place?
I guess, personally, I guess like if there is actual harm, I'm guessing they can sue. But what if there's like violations of, I guess, marketing claims? Because I feel like the main sorts of violations are marketing claims these days.
Yes, definitely. And what we see especially in the UK at the moment, is that advertising standards are actually using AI to scan the net to see which claims are out there and whether they're in breach of the regulatory rules. We do see that more on social media claims, more than product claims, as in claims that which are actually on the product packaging, because obviously it's easier to find those with the help of AI. In terms of the repercussions, obviously you get the negative PR if your brand has been called out. You are generally asked to remove that claim. I've not ever seen an instance where there's been any fine, like a fine of enforcement or even jail time. That's obviously very, very extreme. But generally it tends to be remove the claim, can't use it in any future marketing, and obviously the negative PR that comes with that.
A question from Witchism. Are there common regulatory loopholes that some brands use, like saying 5% retinol on the packaging, but actually having a complex? Are there loopholes that you've seen that you've particularly have noticed?
That is very common, and it is something that I see and I notice across even products that I work on, where I obviously have to feed back to the brand or client that you're saying 5% vitamin C complex, but actually there's only 1% of that is vitamin C. So, working with a regulatory consultant, they should be advising that claim needs to be amended to actually be truthful and honest. And that hits two of the EU's common criteria, which is your technical criteria which claims must meet, and honesty and truthfulness are two of those. So I would definitely be pulling up any claims that I see which may mislead the consumer or may not paint the honest and accurate picture about the product. But it is very common to see complex claims like that.
This is like one of my questions, really. If we see a beauty brand making claims that they shouldn't, what should we do? Both, I guess, from like a reporting point of view, and also, I don't know if you think that maybe I feel like most of us who are familiar-ish with the industry, we think that regulators don't really clamp down hard enough. I guess,
Mhm.
what do you think is effective in both lanes?
If you feel that there's a claim that you're just like, that there's no way that possibly can be true, or something seems a little bit sketchy about it, and you do want to report it, in the UK and local European countries, you can report it to your local government authority. There's actually a website where you can report claims or products that you don't believe are compliant. In the UK as well, you could even go one step further. If you think a claim is actually medicinal and it should not be, and the product is not a medicine, you can report that to the MHRA and they can take action. The most common way that I see action being taken is usually by the ASA, so Advertising Standards in the UK. And that's usually when it is reported to them, be that on their website or via trading standards or via the link that I mentioned when you can report non-compliant products or claims that products you think are non-compliant.
I personally quite like the ASA because I've personally reported something and they actually took action. And I feel like
Yeah.
every other place I've tried reporting things to the Australian TGA, to the US as well, and like it just feels like it goes into the ether. But the ASA, I really like that they actually followed up. I think they followed up after like 9 months, but I was just impressed, honestly.
Yeah, I do think it tends to be a resource issue, and that's why we don't really see much enforcement in the industry, whether that be against a claim or a product. It does seem to be a government resource issue, which all brands are going to take some advantage of. But that's where a brand can actually, get ahead of anything in terms of challenges and just be compliant in the first place.
So this is another one of my personal interest questions. Which region do you personally think A, has the best regulations, and then B, the best enforcement of those regulations?
Personally speaking, and it's just because it's where I am and where I specialize in, I will always say UK, Europe. It's the regulatory framework that makes the most sense to me, being in the industry, and the one that I keep seeing again and again being replicated in other markets. In terms of enforcement, I have to say the UK, because as we've just mentioned, ASA, even though they're slow, you do see the ASA continuously pulling up beauty brands on claims, which is good to see from a consumer trust perspective, a regulatory perspective, even from my side, because then I can use those examples when speaking to brands and saying, actually, we shouldn't be making claims like that because similar brand did the same thing and look what's happened to them. So I would always say regulations UK, EU, because they're 99% the same at the moment. Enforcement, definitely the UK. I've even seen enforcement from MHRA as well.
What is like the most common regulation that you feel like brands break all the time and just don't know about?
It usually depends on the size of the brand. I would say if it's a very small new brand to the market, some brands don't even know a cosmetic regulation exists and that they have to go through a whole process of documentation, stability testing, preservative testing, safety reports, etc. That's where I usually see where that whole step has just been missed and they've just launched a product. And, it's super easy to launch a product when you don't go through the regulatory steps. And I'd say for the more mid-sized to, the very large brands, it's always claims. It is always how far can they take it with claims. And that's not just the claims wording, but also making sure that you have the appropriate substantiation behind that claim. Because you can make a claim on anything. The regulations state you must be able to evidence how you're making that claim, and there's best practice for doing so. So that's where I would differentiate between the small new brands to the more established big brands, definitely.
I think I saw something in the chat box earlier about how apparently South Korea, for their claims on their products, I'm not sure if this is actually true, but I guess hypothetically, apparently they have to submit their claims to the government and then the government tests the claim, or I'm not sure if they test it themselves or if they check it. Do you think that would improve the situation?
It would improve the situation. I don't know if Korea are actually doing that. I wonder if they actually just expect the substantiation to be reviewed by the authorities. But in doing so, if other markets were doing that same thing, it would slow down just the industry as a whole. Everything will be stuck in admin and bureaucracy because the resource just won't be there. We know it won't. So I don't ever see that being a realistic option for other markets. But you will find that some of the, especially the Asian markets, you do have to actually submit a lot of data before launching your product. And that does include claim substantiation.
Cool. Thank you so much, Kamal, for all of that information. It was super interesting. Yeah, we will now go on to our next talk, which is about hair.
Thanks, guys.
Now we have Dr. Paul Cornwell of TRI Princeton. They're an independent nonprofit specializing in hair and skin research, testing, and education. He's here to talk about hair myths. So, our first question is about a trending product category. Do bond builders actually work?
That's a good question. Yes. The issue with cosmetics, I don't know if people who are watching understand, but we're quite heavily regulated. If you issue a product with claims on, you have to be able to support those claims. So if people are claiming bond building, they have claim support for that. How they work is more probably the interesting question for me as a scientist. Bond builders are an interesting new category of claims. They're built on the idea that hair is built up through lots of bonds between the molecules that make up the hair. There are lots of interconnections in the hair that give it its structure and its strength. And what people are starting to understand is that things like, very simple things like water, pH, other things are affecting the structure of hair and breaking and closing those bonds. What they're discovering is that they're able to put small molecules in hair products which interact with these interconnections in the hair, and so change those interconnections, changing the mechanical properties of the hair from the inside, and then giving benefits which are associated with strength and breakage. So that's how they are working. And what we do at TRI is we do a lot of tensile testing for companies looking at the strength of the hair, either stretching it and breaking it, or we do something called fatigue, where we stretch it just a little bit over and over again and look at the breakage that way, testing whether their products are working. We also have a lot of spectroscopy at TRI, where we look at the bonds in terms of what bonds are there and what the relative proportions of those bonds are. And then we look for effects there. A third technique we use in TRI is thermal analysis, where we heat up the hair and we look at the denaturation temperature of the keratins. And that teaches us about how strong the bonds are in the hair, how many crosslinks there are. The higher the temperature, the more crosslinks there are. So if you have a treatment that's affecting that temperature, you've got a treatment that's affecting the bonds and building bonds. So there are many ways that you can investigate bond building and support those claims.
Another question. This is really common advice in hair care forums, not to wash your hair too much. Is that true? Is washing your hair too often bad for your hair?
I've been fascinated by this. I still remember, years ago hearing the folklore about, well, if you don't wash your hair, nature will just balance out and your hair will be fine and you don't need all these nasty products. The evidence I've seen, we're writing a blog about it now, so visit our website in a few weeks' time, is that, when you don't wash your hair, there's a buildup of sebum on the scalp. But buildup of sebum then causes a breakdown of that sebum. The fatty acids released by that breakdown penetrate your skin and irritate it. And there's several studies now that show if you don't wash your hair, the buildup of sebum causes an itchy, dry scalp, even lead further into dandruff and seborrheic dermatitis. We've done some work at TRI looking at the relationship between wash frequency and scalp irritation. And surprise, surprise, the less frequently you wash, the more irritated your scalp is. And that's supported by work by Procter & Gamble that was published a couple of years ago, where they showed the buildup of these fatty acids on the scalp and scalp irritation with less frequent washing. So all the evidence points to washing your hair as frequently as possible. On the other hand, washing with surfactants will pull things out of your hair. That's true. A very small amount, though. And you have to wash your hair an awful lot for that to become important. We can measure those differences and have published work along those lines. You can extract lipids with over shampooing the hair. But on balance, I'd say if you want a healthy scalp and you don't want an itchy scalp, you probably should be washing your hair every 1 or 2 days.
I think a lot of people have been wondering about that for a long time, and it's really nice to know that there are studies to support it as well. So you mentioned nasty products. So is there any truth to that? Is there any advantage to avoiding things like sulfates and silicones and all these ingredients that you see free from on all this packaging?
I'm not a big fan of those claims, to be honest. I think there's a place for them where there's a benefit to the consumer of avoiding something. Say you have an allergy to something and you want to know that the product is free of something that's going to irritate your skin, then that's obviously very useful for a product to say doesn't contain. But there's a lot of misinformation as well about not containing things which weren't dangerous in the first place and wouldn't have been a problem. And sulfates is one of those examples. They say the more often a lie is repeated, the more it becomes the truth. I think that's the case with sulfates. It's a lie that's repeated so often that people now believe it's true. But actually, when you look at the evidence, there's no evidence for sulfates being any worse than any other surfactant or any better. Well, in fact, it's probably better. So let me go through it. I mean, there's worries about sodium lauryl sulfate, SLS. People have read or half read stuff about that irritating the skin. It's true, it does irritate the skin. But when you put it in a surfactant blend in a shampoo, you usually mitigate that quite substantially. And most shampoo products aren't irritating to the scalp unless you've got a very sensitive scalp. So that's the first myth, that it's irritating. Not really, not when it's properly formulated. The other myth is that it's got toxins in it because of dioxanes. Well, the levels of those are parts per million. They're so low that there are no safety hazard to anyone, and they're heavily tested and regulated. The other myth is that it's synthetic, it's a chemical. That's kind of unfair, really, in a way, because the alkyl chain on sulfate surfactants comes from natural products. You might disagree with the palm oil and the coconut oil it comes from. That's a different matter. But, so do all other non-sulfate surfactants contain the same chains. The sulfate head group is just a sulfate head group. There's nothing inherently nasty about that. The other myth is that sulfates are bad for the environment and don't degrade and are polluting our oceans. They're actually very biodegradable surfactants and do degrade within a few days. I think they've had an unfair press, sulfates. If you're looking at alternatives, you have to be... If you're going to be critical like that, you need to look at the alternatives as critically as you've looked at sulfates. I think on balance, they're a good ingredient. They do a very good foaming job, and any formulator watching knows that they're an excellent primary surfactant and cleansing agent. And if used properly, like I say, there's no problem.
And a similar sort of ingredient with silicones, there's so many myths about them. They suffocate your hair, they're made of plastic, they just coat your hair, and they don't actually nourish your hair. Can you tell us a little bit about silicones as well?
Well, silicones is a huge, as you know, is a huge class of molecules. It ranges all the way from small couple of hundred molecular weight molecules all the way up to tens of thousands of molecular weight sized molecules. And they're a diverse set of polymers with different backbones and different side chains. It's quite difficult to talk about silicones in the generality like they do on the social media because they are all so different. There are some silicones, the smaller chain length ones, they're called cyclic silicones, where the polymer chain forms a little ring. People watching might have heard of D4 and D5 silicone, cyclomethicone, which is used a lot in cosmetic products. People are discovering now that there are some environmental issues with D4, and that is no longer used. D5, I'm not up to date on that, but I believe there are regulations coming in for that. Again, it's kind of one of those myths that has started up, and I'd say it's a bit of a lack of imagination for marketeers. They can't think of anything to say, so they say silicone free.
There's a few themes coming through, which I think we've seen in some other talks as well. Things like there's a lot of importance in terms of the overall formula. It's not just about individual ingredients that you have to avoid or not. But I think with hair care in particular, there's also a big focus on who the consumer is. So how much does race or ethnicity matter when it comes to choosing hair care?
That's a really interesting question because we've been doing a lot of work on that in TRI. We've been particularly focused on textured hair, coily or kinky hair, or Walker type 4 or afro or whatever you want to call it. And we've been looking at how that hair breaks. That's one of the interesting questions for that hair type. There's definitely a weakness in that hair type because of the coily structure, which means that it breaks more easily than straighter hair types. And so there's a need with those consumers to find ways of mitigating that And that's what we're researching. Because people have curly hair, they have different styles and different treatment regimes, wash regimes, which impacts then on things like scalp health. As I mentioned, if you're not washing your scalp very frequently because it's such a difficult job or long job to deal with hair that's braided. You've got to unbraid it, you've got to wash it, you've got to dry it, and then you've got to rebraid it. These cause problems in terms of scalp irritation and dryness. So there's definitely different consumer needs related to different hair types, and that's the one we've been focused on. We go all the way to very straight, coarse hair in Asia, for example, and then the need is for softness and conditioning because the hair can feel coarse to the fingers. There's all sorts of different needs, and companies I've worked for in the past, they've got different formulas for different people in different parts of the world because they know how different the needs are for the different people. So you will find that in most brands that products are very different for different parts of the world. People are still trying to work through how we can best meet those needs with technology. There's stuff coming through all the time.
Thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge with us today. I think a lot of people in the audience will find that very, very interesting. And we have time for some audience questions.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that that fireside chat. And the first question for our Q&A, to get ready to it, is from Derm Element, who asks, what's your opinion on hair porosity, or what's going on with hair porosity? And also, how does hair change during different seasons?
Right. Two big questions. The thing in hair care is you can ask not easy questions. That's rude to the person asking the question, but they could seem straightforward questions, but they're actually quite complicated. So porosity is the first one. That's been an area of fascination for the hair science world for a long time. The original work on hair porosity was done with porosity towards water. And one of our colleagues at TRI, Dr. Trevor Evans, has done a lot of work on a technique called dynamic vaposorption, where he looks at water absorption into hair. And you can equate porosity to how easily water enters and leaves the hair. And he measures the kinetics of that uptake and loss of water. So that's one way of measuring porosity. But it's a consumer term, really. So it can have multiple scientific measurements linked to it. So the water porosity is one thing, but something else we're doing, a colleague of mine, Samuel Gurion-Asiko, who is our Skin and Biosubstrates Director, he's looking at how porosity relates to how easily things diffuse through the hair. And he's got all sorts of exciting techniques to look at how quickly water and other molecules diffuse through the hair, and that can be construed as porosity. That it goes on and on. There is no industry standard for what porosity is yet, and that's something we're actively working on in TRI at the moment. I think it's very interesting because porosity is related to damage and the negative effects of porosity. Well, that's another interesting thing. I think there's a consumer study to be done on what consumers think porosity is, which might be very interesting because it might not relate to what we as scientists think of porosity. And that often happens in hair science, that what we think as scientists is something is not what the consumers are talking about. So when consumers talk about porosity, we assume it's uptake of things into hair. But what they might be talking about is how easily their products spread over the hair and disappear into the hair when they're applying them, which is a totally different thing. It's got nothing to do with penetration into the hair. It's just spread of materials into the hair until they disappear from their feel on their fingers. So I think the whole thing is a very interesting subject. Thank you for the question, but I'm sorry I haven't got a clear answer. What was the second question?
The second part was, well, how does hair change during different seasons?
How does hair change during different seasons? I think hair, like skin, has a cycle according to summer and winter in terms of growth rates and things like that. So that's the first thing to say. If you're looking at it from the biological perspective, there is a change in the growth rate in skin and in hair, summer versus winter. And that's why you've got to be very careful when you're doing skin or hair growth studies to make sure that you're controlling for the season in the year that you're measuring it, because the hair slows down or speeds up in its growth as you go through the year. So that's one thing. But I think what the question is asking about is what happens, when there's a lot of humidity, for example, or a lot of sunshine, and that's a whole nother story again. I mean, one of the things I go with humidity. Humidity changes in different seasons of the year. Say in the winter, your hair gets very dry. In climates, maybe not Australia, but some climates where it gets very cold and dry, the humidity is very low. Then hair gains static because you haven't got the water coating on the hair to remove the static from the hair, and you get flyaway and stuff like that. And in hot, temperate climates, you get high humidity, and then your hair starts to frizz up because any style you put into in the morning with your blow drying or your straightening iron gets ruined by the water coming in from the humidity around you. The seasons have a big effect on hair because hair is protein, and proteins react to water and temperature and everything else. So anything a protein will react to, your hair will react to too. So hair is a very reactive substrate.
This next question comes from Mita, who asks, one common myth I see is that shampoo opens the cuticle and conditioners seal and close the cuticle. Can you speak to this?
That's another interesting one, isn't it? I mean, what we do know is that when you wet the hair for a prolonged period, you dunk it under some water, it does swell. And we do know where the water goes when hair swells. Hair swells up to about 40% of its original dry weight with water, so it swells a lot. It swells in the cortex, in the middle of the hair, and it swells in the cuticle as well. And the cuticle swelling does lift the cuticle scales. And so, yes, if you put your hair in water, it will swell. Whether it swells more with a shampoo versus just water, I've never seen the data. I'm not sure there'll be much difference, but please find the data if anyone knows. And the conditioner is in water as well. So I think both shampoo and conditioning will swell hair. And then when you dry it again, it will de-swell. I don't think one or the other is any better or worse for swelling the cuticle, from what I've seen.
This next question comes from Nurul, who asks, is dimethicone really bad for your hair? And then what does it do to the hair? Yeah.
Dimethicone for people watching is a silicone. Silicones are a class of chemicals that have been developed by the industry to do lots of things. You've got silicone everywhere in your house, but for hair care, silicones are used to condition the surface of the hair, right? Sometimes even to style the hair. And what they do is they spread on the surface of the hair, and they've got unique physical properties which gives them the slip and the smooth feel on the surface of the hair, which is quite unique and quite useful. And so silicones are extremely popular in the hair industry for making the hair feel nice and healthy. So silicones aren't really bad for your hair at all. In fact, I'd say they're good for your hair because conditioning, the word conditioning means keeping your hair in good condition. If you don't have silicones and other conditioning agents on your hair, then when you're brushing and combing your hair, you're damaging the hair, and the hair will be less good condition. So actually, silicones are probably quite good for your hair. And they're widely used for that very reason.
And that's all the time that we have for this Q&A. 10 minutes really isn't enough time, but thank you so much, Paul, for agreeing to do this. And with that, we'll go into the next fireside chat. Thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you.
We're very honoured to have Professor David Whiteman here to talk about sunscreen myths. He is a medical epidemiologist at QIMR Berghofer in Queensland. His research has influenced a lot of Australian sun protection policy, and he is currently leading the Q-Skin study, and that is the world's largest prospective skin cancer study. So let's get right into it. Our first big myth going around social media: does sunscreen cause skin cancer?
No, sunscreen does not cause skin cancer. Sunscreen prevents skin cancer, and it does that very effectively, very effectively.
That is a nice and short summary. Now, the flip side, I don't know if you've seen, but there are some people saying that the evidence that sunscreen can prevent skin cancer isn't very strong. A lot of them are raising the fact that there's only really been one proper randomized controlled trial, the NAMBA study, that shows that sunscreen actually prevents skin cancer. Can you explain why that doesn't mean that sunscreen isn't preventing skin cancer? How do we actually know that sunscreen prevents skin cancer if that is the only great piece of evidence we have?
Yeah, look, it's a good question that people ask. I think it's always good to be across the literature and to ask, how do we know things to be true or not? A randomized trial is the highest form of evidence that we can do for any clinical intervention, because you are actually giving real people in real life whatever intervention it is. So for the sunscreen intervention that was done in the NAMBOR study, people were given free sunscreen and instructions how to use it or not, and they were just given general advice. And those people had to use the sunscreen every day for 5 years and then follow them up over time for another 5 years. So you've got a 10-year study. So the reason there's only one of these studies is they're so hard to do. They are so expensive. They take so much effort and so much leadership and so much follow-up that no one's going to have the gumption to ever do one of these again. So there's only ever going to be one randomized trial on sunscreen. I would put a massive bet on that. So that's going to be the best evidence we have in terms of a clinical trial. But we have lots of other forms of evidence as well. So we do have animal studies, and I know not everyone's in favor of animal studies, but they do fill in a lot of gaps. But we also have experiments that I have done and others have done where we apply sunscreen or not to volunteers' arms and expose them to really small doses of UV using spectral lamps that replicate the wavelengths of sunlight. And then we take skin biopsies, and in those biopsies you can see how much DNA damage there is, how much the genes have been switched on, how much the immune cells have been activated. And always when you have the biopsy from the sunscreen protected site, it always shows much less DNA damage, much less inflammation, much less immune perturbation than the unprotected site, which is clearly the early hallmarks of the processes leading to cancer. So we have really solid evidence that sunscreen prevents the early steps of cancer and protects the skin against damage caused by UV. So really, I don't know what more evidence people need. You're not going to get it. So this is the evidence base, but it's pretty strong, I would say, compared to a lot of things that people take on faith in other branches of health that have a much less strong evidence base. So it's as good as it gets, folks. That's it.
Another really common idea on social media: can sunscreen cause vitamin D deficiency?
Look, this has been bandied around for quite some time. In theory, anything that reduces the transmission of ultraviolet B radiation to the cells of the skin will reduce the ability to synthesize vitamin D. That is true. So in theory, use of sunscreen can reduce your ability to synthesize vitamin D. The truth is that we only need a tiny amount of exposure to the sun in order to be replete with vitamin D, to generate enough vitamin D in our body. And so there have been some laboratory studies done in which volunteers have been lathered in sunscreen and then exposed to sun lamps or UV, and they do show reduced levels of vitamin D compared to if they hadn't had that sunscreen. But when we do field studies and we actually take samples from people who are using sunscreen, even people who are heavy sunscreen users but out in real life, we see no difference between those who are heavy sunscreen users and those who are not sunscreen users in terms of their vitamin D. So it's a trick question in a sense. In theory, yes, but in all the practical usage that we've observed in studies, we see no difference. I would add one follow-up to that is that right now in Queensland, led in Queensland, but actually Australia-wide, a randomised trial is being done by my colleague, Professor Rachel Neal, in which they are randomising people right across the country to receive sunscreen or not. They're given free sunscreen. They're told to use it as much as they can, and they're being compared with people who were just given some normal sun protection advice. And they've been taking blood samples throughout the year, so to map the seasonal fluctuations in vitamin D. And I don't have the results yet. We don't know what they are, but they'll come soon, and that will sort of definitively, I would say, put this issue to bed one way or the other. But from everything we know now, normal use of sunscreen by normal people going about their normal activities doesn't lead to any reduction in vitamin D.
There are so many different types of sunscreen products on the market. I'm sure you've seen a whole bunch of these, and there are always questions about which ones are more effective and which ones aren't. So I think we all know that creams and lotions, they are very effective. They're the most common type. But in terms of other products like sunscreen sprays, are they going to be effective?
Look, again, that's a big question. There's a lot to unpack there. It would depend on where people are in the world. I would say if you're buying sunscreens in Australia that have been passed by the Australian TGA, then what it says on the label is what you get in the bottle. There's very strict regulations on what's in the sunscreen. So, but that doesn't apply all around the world. So if you're in Australia, you're fortunate, your sunscreen is going to be a sunscreen. But then it's critical that you apply it properly. And this is where the sprays and other things get into strife, because the application of sunscreen from a spray has been shown in a number of studies to be much less effective than putting on a lotion or a cream. And even then, most people don't put on enough. They really don't. So you've really got to put it on pretty thickly. The sprays have been shown to lose about up to 90% of their actual protective effect, what it says on the bottle, because when people spray, it drifts off into the wind, it lands on their towel or their togs or some other thing, and it doesn't go on the skin. So that's why the sprays are not endorsed as strongly as creams and lotions, because it's the application that lets you down, and people often don't put enough on in the first place.
So, on the topic of alternatives to sunscreen that people try to make work, have you heard about sun protective and tanning supplements? To what extent do they work, and would they be able to replace a sunscreen?
Look, I'm really not familiar with any reputable products of that kind. I am aware that people have been trying for decades to stimulate melanin production in the skin, so to use the body's natural ability to create tanning pigment in the skin. But for people of European, Caucasian ancestry, the most that a tan is going to give you is about an SPF of 3. Increasingly, it seems that those products where you swallow something or inject something, they are messing with the body's hormones and biochemistry. And there are case reports of quite nasty adverse events, including melanomas and things. So personally, I would steer well clear of those kinds of products, because they are affecting your whole body and you'd rather put a cream on the bits that are going to be exposed, and find one that works for you. I think that's the secret that you would say to your listeners as well, is that different people react in different ways. And sure, some people get irritations or allergies, but there will be a product out there that you can apply that will not cause damage to your skin or cause a reaction or irritation, that won't be greasy, that will, people have different likes and dislikes is what I'm saying. But I would really steer clear of an injectable or a swallowed, because that's messing with the body's entire system. And I think they're potentially dangerous, but also probably don't work as well.
If you have dark skin, does that mean that you don't need to use sunscreen or other sun protective measures?
No, it does not mean that. We do know that darkly pigmented skin suffers less DNA damage and less stress to the skin cells because of the pigment that's in the skin. And this has been shown in quite a few studies, including in some really nicely done experiments much more recently by Professor Anthony Young in the UK, where they've estimated that for people of African ancestry, so equatorial African ancestry, their skin has the effective SPF of about 60. So really high protection. But even so, it's not fully protective. It does fluctuate throughout the year and according to background sun exposure. So It's still best to protect the skin, but clearly people with pigmented skin have much lower risks of skin cancer overall, and conversely have higher levels of vitamin D deficiency, especially if they live away from the equator. So it's not as necessary as for people with fair skin types.
Thank you so much, Professor Whiteman. We're now going to move on to some audience questions.
Due to the time difference, David isn't able to join us here today live, but still ask your questions and you'll see his responses on the Beauty SciComm Instagram feed shortly. Michelle and I are also super excited to announce the next Beauty SciComm initiative. A Beauty SciComm Contest. Do you want to do science communication online? Send us your 90-second or less video in portrait reel format of you explaining a topic in the realm of cosmetic sciences for your chance to win. Contest will open Monday. We'll be announcing more details on how to apply on the Beauty SciComm Instagram page. Prizes include $250, a mentorship session with Michelle and I, your choice of a Society of Cosmetic Chemists year membership or an online CEP course, a year membership with the Independent Beauty Association, a regulatory AMA call with IBA's regulatory director, Meredith Patillo, and a chance to be featured in Cosmetics and Toiletries. Big thank you to CNT, IBA, and the SCC for agreeing to partner with us for this. Submission deadline is on September 20th. There will be 2 winners, which will be announced at the upcoming Truth in Beauty e-Summit by myself on the EcoWell platform. Massive thank you to Nawal at Derm Element for coming up with this idea to have the SciComm contest and for all of your hard work getting this off the ground. Interested in supporting this initiative? Please share. Also, if you learned something valuable at the camp here today, please be sure to also share the replay and tag us. We'll now enter a few-minute break before we return with the skincare myth fireside chat with Dr. Aegean Chan.
I'm with Dr. Aegean Chan. She is a board-certified dermatologist and dermapathologist. She is the medical director of California Dermatology Group. She is one of my favorite dermatologists to follow on Instagram and TikTok, and she's here with us to bust some skincare myths. So let's start with a doozy, which is, can skin get used to skincare products? Do you need to rotate and switch out your products every once in a while?
The answer is more complicated than a straight yes or no. So yes, your skin on a biologic level can get acclimated to product. So I'll give the example of a retinoid. Most people that have tried using a retinoid, they notice that when they first start using the retinoid, they tend to have a lot of irritation, some sensitivity, skin flaking. And as you use that product consistently for a few weeks, that tends to be less. So that is your skin cells getting used to that, even though you're not altering the frequency of the product. However, this sort of concept that you have to change what skincare products you're using periodically is not something that I think is based in any evidence. I think it actually is more of a problem of perception, especially when we're talking about skincare products with active ingredients like retinoids or alpha hydroxy acids. When you first start using that product, it's kind of like the honeymoon phase. You're going to have a pretty noticeable improvement from your baseline. So improvement in skin texture, dullness. But if you're using that product on a regular basis, your baseline moves and you're not able to notice as big of a change in your skin texture when you're using something regularly. For people that look at their skin and they say, I'm really happy with my skin quality, I like how my skin feels, I like how it looks, there's no need to change what products you're using unless you want to. But on a biologic level, there's no need for you to do that. But if you're looking at your skin and you still feel like you want to have some more improvement, you want to improve the skin texture, there is still some hyperpigmentation that you want to treat, then that's when I say, if you're using a product for 3 or 4 months, you're noticing a plateau on your improvement, then you may want to reconsider changing up the active ingredient, maybe using something a little bit stronger to achieve your skin goals.
Another idea I see all the time is fragrance actually bad for your skin, or is it a bit more nuanced than that?
So fragrance is not as bad as the internet makes it seem. As a dermatologist, I really feel like for a true allergy to fragrance is not extremely common. And I think it seems more common on the internet than it is in real life. So I pulled out some data. One study did show that the prevalence of true fragrance allergy in the general population, I think this was a US study, is between 0.7% and 2.6%. In my opinion, as a dermatologist, I think that most people with healthy skin without chronic skin barrier issues or skin sensitivity issues are going to tolerate fragrance reasonably well. That said, depending on the product, depending on the level of the fragrance or what specific fragrance ingredients are included in the product, you may have a little bit more sort of sensitivity or some symptoms. Sort of as an aside, there is, I think, a lot of confusion between a true allergy and a sensitivity. I hear people describe sort of tiny little bumps or sort of irritation to products that may be to the fragrance, maybe to other ingredients in the formulation, and you can probably speak to that more. More often than not is sort of a non-specific irritant contact dermatitis, which isn't a specific allergy. So I think if you're sort of noticing these recurrent patterns, it may be worth getting patch tested to see if you actually have a true fragrance allergy. But for most people, I don't recommend wholesale just avoiding all fragrance in skincare. I see more problems actually with people that use products with essential oils. I actually see more allergies and irritant reactions to essential oils, especially those in deodorants. So that said, I think for the lay person, for most people, there is a joy in fragrance. I think sort of the fun part of skincare can be that experience you get from the fragrance. So I hate telling people to avoid fragrance unless you specifically have a history of issues with fragrance. And if you have a background of skin conditions like atopic dermatitis, where you have a skin barrier issue, you are going to be more prone to acquiring an allergy to fragrance. So you may want to be sort of judicious about how much fragrance you use. Or if you have rosacea, people that have active rosacea flares, you may be more sensitive to fragrance and just in general products with active ingredients. So you might want to be a little bit more careful and use products that may be fragrance free, formulated for more sensitive skins. Personally, I love fragrance. It's sort of a shame that I think people feel like they shouldn't be using fragrance if they want good skin. And I think that often is correlated, and I don't think that's true.
Another popular topic is retinoids, and there are so many myths floating around about retinoids, which, for anyone who doesn't already know, these are vitamin A derivatives. They're often called the gold standard for skincare. So can you take us through some of the myths that I'm sure you've seen as well?
Oh, there are so many, but my absolute favorite, least known myth is whether or not you can use retinoids in breastfeeding. Retinoids are safe in breastfeeding. So tell everybody that is breastfeeding, they can resume their topical retinoids on their face. And I think it really is sort of a carryover from the recommendations during pregnancy. So topical retinoids are minimally absorbed into your circulation. And if you sort of think back, the recommendations that are given to you during pregnancy, that has to do with the development of a fetus. You really don't want to be applying anything or ingesting anything that has the potential of harming the development of your fetus. But while you're breastfeeding, you already have a fully grown, developed baby outside of your body. So the risk profile is very different. There's a wonderful resource for breastfeeding mothers called LactMed. It's sort of a sub database under PubMed. You can look up any medication and it compiles all the data in breastfeeding for specific medication. So there is one for tretinoin specifically. Based on the data that's out there, there's no harm to a fully grown, developed infant from ingesting breast milk that may have trace amounts of vitamin A derivative in it. So that's one of the biggest myths that I love debunking, but also a really common one that's so relevant right now is that you have to stop your retinoids in the summer. So this myth comes from early retinoid studies where they sort of correlated the redness, irritation, and skin flaking of retinoid use with sun exposure and an increased sensitivity to UV light. And that actually has been shown to not be the case. Using a retinoid does not make your skin more likely to burn if you are exposed to the same amount of UV light. There is some thought that if you have retinoid irritation, that maybe the heat from being outside in the sun can sort of exacerbate that and make it feel worse, which is why people sort of say, oh, it feels worse in the summer. But there's no direct correlation between photosensitivity and retinoid use. That said, tretinoin in particular is photosensitive. It breaks down in the sunlight. So we recommend that people use it at night and don't use it during the day. So it's sort of, that myth came from these confusing indications. Dermatologists say only use it at night, but the reason why is we don't want the medication to break down. Another one that comes up often is that you can't apply your retinoids around the eye area. And I think there's been some correlation with dry eye or affecting the meibomian glands or the oil producing glands on your eyelid margin. I think if you are careful and not really applying it close enough to your eyelid margin or your conjunctiva, you don't necessarily need to worry about adverse effects on the oil glands around your eye. That said, the skin around your eye, one needs retinoids because it is the most thin and it is most susceptible to UV damage. So applying it to that area is going to sort of counteract that potential UV damage. It also is more susceptible to retinoid irritation. So you want to sort of balance those two things. So I just apply my different around on my lower eyelids and sort of in the area under my orbital bone. I don't really apply it where the crease is because I don't think it's really getting that much UV exposure in general. But if you apply it there and you notice more irritation, you might want to try some eye creams with retinoids that are sort of formulated to be more gentle around the eye area.
Okay, so the next topic is something I care a lot about, which is pigment. And I feel like every week there is a new pigment fading tip on social media. Can you tell us what actually works for fading pigment?
I have bad news because in my clinical experience, I find that the only thing that really is truly effective is hydroquinone. In my clinical practice for patients that need to fade hyperpigmentation, I give a combination of hydroquinone with a retinoid, typically tretinoin, and a topical steroid. So that's sort of the original Triluma triple mix. It's shown to be synergistic when used in combination. I think the options over the counter are a bit limited. I see a lot of patients that have tried everything and nothing really worked. So I think there are ingredients that will help to some degree, but it's pretty minimal. So an ingredient I love is azelaic acid. It's pretty well tolerated. And so I do think it works for mild hyperpigmentation, but I think for more resistant hyperpigmentation, most people do need prescription medications. And then the acids, so alpha hydroxy acid, particularly glycolic acid, does help accelerate lifting of the pigment, but this mostly applies to more superficial pigment. And then I will say just sunscreen and sun avoidance, being really, really diligent with those two things will improve melasma in particular for a lot of people.
Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us today. And in general as well, we have time for some audience questions. So now we have some questions for Aegean about skin. Our first question is from Mona. Can hyaluronic acid products increase sensitivity to actives?
Yes, in theory. So putting hyaluronic acid on your skin can hydrate the skin and theoretically make it a little bit more porous so that active ingredients can penetrate the skin a little bit better. And this may be a benefit because it may make your actives more effective. But if you're layering hyaluronic acid with an active ingredient and you're noticing more irritation, I would maybe then pull back on the hyaluronic acid. So it's definitely person dependent. And again, in theory, it's possible. But I would say for most people with normal, healthy skin barriers without any underlying issues, it probably won't make a noticeable difference.
We have a question from Jessie, which is what to say when someone says you need to detox your armpits when they're talking about natural deodorants not working. So if your natural deodorant's not working, some people say it's just because your armpits aren't detoxed yet from your aluminium deodorant.
So take a deep breath, like I am. Detox is kind of a trigger word for me because that sort of falls into the pseudoscience of it all. I don't think that's a valid scientific concept, is this concept of detoxing. In my professional opinion, natural deodorants just don't work as well as aluminum-based antiperspirants. So the difference is natural deodorants just use typically essential oils, or other things to mask odor, maybe reduce some of the bacteria in the armpit that can lead to odor, whereas antiperspirants actually use aluminum to plug up the sweat glands to actually reduce sweating, and that tends to be much more effective in controlling both sweat and in controlling odor. So I would say if somebody says that to you, that's not real, and just say it doesn't work as well. But my other caveat about natural deodorants, and I see so many patients come in with rashes once they start a new natural deodorant. Usually the story is, 2 weeks ago I was in Whole Foods or some other natural food store, picked up a natural deodorant, and now I have this rash in my armpit. And typically that is an allergy to the essential oils they use. Essential oils are pretty unstable, they're pretty allergenic, and armpit skin, because of the occlusion and it's thin skin to begin with, it's highly prone to becoming irritated to certain substances. So that is my caution to people when using natural deodorants in general.
Now, a question from Nurul. Is it true that when we use a certain type of skincare for a period of time, our skin will get used to it and will not have any improvement after that amount of time?
So this is something that I hear a lot, and it sort of anthropomorphizes our skin, as our skin's going to get bored, it's going to get used to it. But what I think is actually happening is if somebody uses a certain active ingredient for a period of time, your results sort of plateau. So if you start to use it initially, usually the first 3 months, you may notice a big difference from your baseline to 3 months after starting a product. But after about 3 months, if you've sort of reached maximum efficacy, then from day to day after that 3 month point, you're not seeing as big of a jump, as big of an improvement. So you can sort of interpret that as your skin getting used to it. So how I tell patients, I say, well, then reassess your skin at that mark. If you're not noticing much improvement, if there are things that you would like to improve, hyperpigmentation, texture issues, then maybe you need to tweak your active ingredient that you're using. So go up on the strength of the retinoid you're using, maybe increase the percentage of the acid that you're using so that you could boost your results. But if you're plateauing, but you're happy with how your skin looks, then I don't really see a need to change anything. So it really just depends on the person, because if you do change things, you do risk, a little bit of a purge, maybe additional dryness and irritation. So those are the risks and the benefits to balance if you're noticing that.
We've got a couple of questions about hydroquinone. So the first one is, do you believe hydroquinone should be avoided by those who are maybe a bit darker skin or anyone in general? Like, are there people who should avoid it?
So I think there has been a bit of a backlash against hydroquinone because I've seen a bit of marketing that, it says hydroquinone free. As a dermatologist, hydroquinone is one of our most effective ingredients for hyperpigmentation. There are a lot of anti-hyperpigmentation ingredients out there on the market, including azelaic acid, kojic acid, topical tranexamic acid, etc. But for dermatologists, our first line treatment that we use for patients with hyperpigmentation, particularly melasma and solar lentiginase or sunspots, is typically hydroquinone. There is a risk of irritation. So I think that this sort of backlash against use of hydroquinone in darker skin is probably due to this risk of irritation. So if you have longstanding irritation in darker skin tones, say type, I would say 3 and above, you may risk some long-lasting hyperpigmentation. But if you pull back before that irritation becomes chronic, then you have less of a risk of that irritation-induced post-inflammatory hyperpigmentation. And then the other risk with hydroquinone is called ochronosis. So that's where you can get a paradoxical deposition of pigment in the skin from hydroquinone. And really, that has not been reported at lower doses. So any hydroquinone that you should be using should be prescribed from a physician. I know there's some sort of black market. I think in the developing world, it's easier to get hydroquinone that's not been prescribed by a physician, but it's those sort of off-market hydroquinones that have a higher risk of ochronosis developing. So those are because we just don't know what concentration, what grade of the ingredient is being used. Whereas I don't believe there's been many cases of use where the person has been supervised by a medical professional and they're using pharmaceutical grade hydroquinone, that it subsequently results in ochronosis. So just to sum it up, I think it is a very safe, very effective ingredient, but like with everything, dose matters. It matters where you're getting it and having somebody supervise you using it appropriately. So typically, I don't have patients use it for more than 3 months continuously. If a patient's using it for mild hyperpigmentation, I say as soon as you reach your treatment goal, stop that medication, stop the hydroquinone, and then use a non-hydroquinone product, cycle in azelaic acid. I really like topicals faded. I find that it's pretty effective. It's very cost effective. I know there's a lot of other brands out there as well. And then, after 3 months, you can cycle back in your hydroquinone. So, and then, you can also concurrently use your acids and your retinoids as well.
So another question, which is kind of on the topic of retinoids, from Nest Gang. Should someone in their early 20s start using retinol products to prevent aging? Like, is there a certain age where people should start looking at using retinoids and, yeah.
So anti-aging, I think in general, the age to start those things is younger and younger. I mean, if we even talk about the Sephora Kids trend, there's 10-year-olds using anti-wrinkle masks. So it can get pretty extreme. I would say if you are in your 20s and you have grown up in a fairly sunny area and you had a lot of sun exposure in your past, maybe you have a history of tanning, maybe you weren't as diligent about sunscreen in your youth as I was growing up in California. I would say probably starting a retinoid, a gentle one, you don't have to be that aggressive, but starting something in your mid 20s, it won't hurt. Again, you don't need to push it. You don't need to be flaking, irritated, and getting into a good consistent habit with it will give you long-term benefits. So I would say it wouldn't be a bad idea. If you're not sure whether or not you need to start it, I would say if you're starting to notice changes in your skin associated with chronic sun exposure. So if you're starting to see sunspots, if you're starting to see sort of slight texture changes, maybe crepiness or some fine lines, maybe if you're starting to see, some fixed lines, some fixed wrinkles, then starting a retinoid may help kind of delay that process a bit.
All right, we have time, I think, for one more question. So this one is from Darky Doom, which is about what sorts of foods cause acne? What does the science actually say about that? And some of the foods mentioned are sugar, chocolate, milk, or other, I guess.
So I will say that this is a very difficult topic to study and very difficult topic to control for. But the studies that would have been fairly big dietary studies that have pretty convincingly showed that one, low fat milks can be associated with worsening acne, and then just basically high glycemic foods, which these foods fall into. So chocolate, fried foods, those can fall into that. I don't think that there's a lot of specific foods that patients will attribute to their acne worsening. And, so there's not often a lot of data specifically looking at those specific foods like chocolate. But again, I think in general for health, having a low glycemic index diet is probably better for you in general. And, there's a lot of interacting factors with acne. hormonal, environmental, genetic, that we can't control for. So I think it is difficult to provide a definitive answer for that. So I will say, in addition to diet, it's really important to get on a very good, diligent topical regimen. Maybe take the oral antibiotics if your doctor is suggesting that. I think altering your diet can be a good adjunct, but I don't think that should be a primary treatment for anybody's acne.
Thank you so much, Aegean. It's always so fun to talk skin with you. Now I'm going to hand back to Jen to close out our Beauty Myths camp.
And I just wanted to thank all of you in the audience for attending here today. Thank you so much for joining us. If you would like to support this initiative, the big thing that we ask of you is for you to share. It's going to be a 2.5-hour replay available right away. So please share it with your network if you think they may find it valuable. A massive thank you to all of our speakers for agreeing to donate their time and expertise to make this possible. They all did this for free because they care. So thank you so much. And finally, for the contest, that's going to be launched. You'll see more information about this on our Instagram page on Monday. So stay tuned for that. And that's all we have. Thank you so much for spending your Saturday here with us, whichever time zone you're in. Michelle, it's currently after midnight, and for me, it's first thing in the morning in Canada. So whoever you are, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you have a great rest of your Saturday.